Chapter 489. Seeing the drastic change in the situation, Dongxuan's morale was unprecedentedly high. Whether it was the general or the soldiers, everyone seemed to have been injected with adrenaline, howling as they charged forward. Yutong Side, on the other hand, watched everything with gritted teeth. Many of their eyes were rimmed with tears. They could only watch helplessly as the other party moved and completed their target bit by bit, gradually taking down the city that was their natural stronghold. It made every Yutong soldier feel so aggrieved that they wanted to die. The feeling was excruciating. It was even more excruciating than having one's flesh sliced by a blunt knife. Qiu Jianhan, who had long known that the Fortress of Resilience would not be able to hold on, was not completely inactive. He had evacuated all the wounded soldiers and citizens in the fort. Before the wounded soldiers left, their cries were deafening. Many of them cried and begged their comrades, "Let me stay. I don't have an arm anymore, but give me a saber and I can still drag an enemy down with me. Let me stay. I'm not leaving. Even if you kill me now and carry my body up the fort wall and pile it with stones, your father can still raise Yutong's status by half a foot." The wounded soldiers begged bitterly. However, Qiu Jianhan and Fu Baoguo were unwavering and uncompromising. There is only meaning in your lives. You are Yutong seeds, or you can cultivate new seeds. You are nothing when you are dead. Military order, live on. No one is allowed to die, no matter what. Whoever dies will never acknowledge you as our comrade when we meet you in the underworld. Live on, because Yutong's Fortress of Resilience is still here. You are the Fortress of Resilience. The so-called indestructible fortress has never been the Fortress of Resilience itself, but the Yutong's eastern troop that is stationed here, the Eastern Soldiers. Old Marshal Qiu was teary-eyed. Live on, all of you. Brothers, you must live on. Live on to see Yutong's counterattack. Live on to help us train the new recruits. Stay alive, and watch over our beautiful lands and rivers for us. Looking at the old marshal's tears, all the wounded soldiers fell silent, no longer speaking. The wounded soldiers began to evacuate in batches. They were exceptionally swift in their retreat. They had to move quickly and leave a wide path for the army to follow. This was to prevent the disabled from blocking the path and obstructing the movement of the army. Even if I can't be loyal to the country with my brothers here, I can't be a burden to the army. We still have a mission. Even if the Fortress of Resilience before us falls, there's still us, another human-shaped Fortress of Resilience. Dongxian, damned invaders. Wait for the other Fortress of Resilience. Time passed by slowly. On the 9th day, Dongxuan's strategic deployment was basically completed. The gentle slope below was only less than 30 feet from the top of the city wall. As long as a warrior had a decent foundation, he or she would be able to reach such a height easily. Dongxuan's army had thus gathered their experts, all of Dongxuan's martial world experts, military experts, and sect experts were gathered together. Yutong, on the other hand, was also gathering skilled cultivators. Both sides are doing the same thing. Only profound Xiuzhe could deal with profound Xiuzhe. In the current situation, Xiuzhe, who had never been welcomed on the battlefield, was unexpectedly welcomed like never before. This was the key to this battle. It was on this night that Qiu Jianhan ordered. The 500,000 barrels of kerosene that he had collected during this period of time, as well as the ones that he had ordered before the expedition, were divided into 5 waves, and the first wave was scattered. A thick layer of kerosene flowed on the gentle slope. Much of it flowed down the slope in a sticky but unstoppable manner. The entire slope that stretched for dozens of miles was already covered in kerosene. In just a moment, the pungent smell filled the air. The kerosene on the top of the fort was still being poured down. Han Sanhe looked at the sea of kerosene, his expression uncertain. He did not give the order to attack even after a long time had passed. He knew very well that this was Qiu Jianhan's last move. The real last move. Just like he had said, he could think of everything that Qiu Jianhan could think of, and so could the other party. Therefore, this situation had long been within their expectations. As long as Dongxuan's soldiers could charge through this inferno of kerosene, the fortress of resilience would be Dongxuan's. In spite of this, Han Sanhe still hesitated when it came to it. What he saw before him was no longer just kerosene that stretched for dozens of miles, but kerosene that covered dozens of miles. The entire area was filled with kerosene. Although Yutong had fallen into an unprecedented disadvantage, they would still need a relatively large-scale attack if they wanted to take down the fortress of resilience. Without tens of thousands of men, there was no threat at all. It was only a matter of time for him to mobilize tens of thousands of men to attack once he gave the order. However, once the tens of thousands of men charged into the kerosene before them, as long as the fire flared, these tens of thousands of men would have no chance of survival. There would be no hope of survival at all. Fire arrows. Han Sanhe still gave the order. Since the sea of fire is bound to appear, let us ignite the kerosene. Han Sanhe chuckled humorlessly. The concentrated fire arrows landed on the kerosene like a thunderstorm. With a loud boom, the flames that soared into the sky were ignited. In just an instant, the sea of fire had obscured everyone's vision from both sides. For a moment, the heat wave spread for dozens of miles. Everyone retreated at once, not daring to linger. Qiu Jianhan's maniacal laughter came from the top of Tiantang's wall. Han Sanhe, you finally started the fire. This old man had thought that you had a heart of stone, but you still have concerns. Han Sanhe's so-called decisiveness in killing is nothing more than this. Han Sanhe shook his head with a bitter smile but did not say anything. Once the fire was ignited, Dongxuan's army would not be able to charge over during the time the kerosene burned. The size of the sea of fire formed by the thick kerosene was probably even greater than a river of magma. Judging from the current scale of the kerosene, it would take at least a day and a night for it to completely burn. A day and a night would be enough to melt more than 10 feet of the frozen slope that Han Sanhe had painstakingly piled up during this period of time. Although the fortress of resilience would be damaged in the fire as well, to the extent that it was almost destroyed, Qiu Jianhan did not care anymore. After all, the fortress of resilience was destined to fall. It was not important whether it was destroyed or not. Instead, Dongxuan's army would need at least 2 days to fill up the 10 feet of the frozen slope. 2 days later, this piece of land would once again be covered with kerosene. Qiu Jianhan had collected more than 500,000 barrels of kerosene in a frenzy. He had even collected the kerosene cans from the army's cooking and the people's homes. It was all for this final, frenzied gamble, to delay the fall of the fortress as much as possible. Furthermore, no matter how knowledgeable Han Sanhe was, he would not know how much kerosene Yutong had prepared. No matter what, before the fortress of resilience finally fell, Qiu Jianhan would want at least 100,000 Dongxian soldiers to be buried with him. After that, it would be time for you, Han Sanhe, and the rest of us to fight to the death. Qiu Jianhan looked at the rising flames, his eyes filled with determination and cruelty. Han Sanhe, if you don't pay with these 100,000 lives, how can you live up to the name of Qiu Jianhan's final battle? Fu Baogua. Yes, General. Order. Bring all the steel cavalry and the serving troop out of the fortress at once and retreat to the West Mountain. Qiu Jianhan said, other than Tianxian Cliff, all the peaks and ridges in the West Mountain have been demolished by me these days. That place is the final narrow area leading to the nation's border. By then, your steel cavalry and the serving troop will form another line of defense there. It will be Yutong's second fortress of resilience. I'd rather fight to the last man than let Han Sanhe pass so easily. Fu Baogua's tears streamed down his cheeks. Old Marshal, this lowly general thinks that it's better for old Marshall to do this. This lowly general doesn't have complete control over the steel cavalry. Only old Marshall can take charge of the situation. The plan here has been set. Let this general stay. F***ck off. Qiu Jianhan was furious. Scram. I'm not leaving. I can't be the one who should leave. Fu Baoguo was defiant, which was rare for him. His face was resolute. This general has already sworn to heaven that this body will live and die with the fortress of resilience. Old Marshall is forcing me to go against my oath by asking me to leave. F***ck your ancestors. F***ck your oath. What nonsense are you talking about? This is a battlefield, a military camp. Even if God is here, he can only listen to your father's military orders. Those who disobey military orders will be beheaded immediately. Qiu Jianhan was unreasonable. Your father, scram immediately. Your father isn't letting you live, I'm letting you die in battle somewhere else. Didn't you hear that it's also the fortress of resilience? How is this going against your **t oath? Scram, scram, scram. What are you waiting for? Your father will kill you. Chapter 490. Marshall, the thickness of the ice has dropped more than expected. Besides, Yutong has poured kerosene again. How much is it this time? I still don't see any decrease in the amount. Fire arrows, burn it. Han Sanhe gave his order. A few days later. Marshal, Yutong is pouring kerosene again. Can you tell how much is it exactly? I can't tell. At least, I don't see any signs of it decreasing compared to the previous times. Fire arrows, burn it. Han Sanhe frowned deeply. Qiu Jianhan, how much kerosene have you F***king collected? Why can't you burn it all? It's been burned 4 times already. Each time, it's a huge amount of kerosene that's genuine. Why is there still so much? Watching the billowing smoke from afar, Han Sanhe's frown deepened, as if he could vaguely sense that something was amiss. Zhang Gu, who was following beside Han Sanhe, was frowning as well, deep in thought. The slope that he had built should have been a textbook stroke of genius, but today, it had been completely sealed by Qiu Jianhan's kerosene. Although there were no major casualties among the troops, it was not a good idea to continue this stalemate. Speed was the most important factor in military affairs. Any delay would lead to changes. Who knew what would happen if this stalemate continued for so many days? The best-case scenario was that Yutong's kerosene would run out, but the current situation was that the kerosene seemed to be endless and could not be depleted no matter how hard they tried. At least we didn't get smothered today, Zhang Gu said with lingering fear as he wiped his face. The few times the kerosene had retaliated, thick smoke billowing and engulfing Dongxuan's base. Han Sanhe and Zhang Gu, who had been observing the situation from the front lines with Han Sanhe, were utterly disheveled by the smoke. Han Sanhe was stunned when he heard that and frowned. You didn't get smothered today? He looked at the opposite side with a frown and suddenly ordered, send a few people with a higher cultivation base to take a closer look at the kerosene later. As soon as the order was given, several Peak Realm cultivators rushed over against the monstrous flames. Reporting to Marshall, the kerosene that Yutong has splashed this time isn't pure kerosene. It's mixed with a lot of water. Although it can still burn, the actual fire is much weaker than the previous few times. Hearing the report, a faint smile hung on Han Sanhe's face, as if he had expected it. Zhang Gu perked up as well. Teacher, looks like Qiu Jianhan doesn't have much kerosene left. Han Sanhe said faintly, even if it's not much, it can still burn and still be lethal. Still ignore him. Continue to wait. Another 2 days later. The fortress of resilience was calm. There was no oil pouring down like before. On Han Sanhe's side, the generals were whispering to each other, barely concealing their excitement. "Marshal, let's attack." Yutong is no longer pouring oil down. It's always the same amount of kerosene every time. No matter how prepared they are, it should have been used up by now. Now it must have been used up. Yes, yes. Now is the best time for us to seize the opportunity and attack. Instead, it was Han Sanhe who thought about it for a moment before he said, "We will attack from 3 sides at the same time this time." Each side. He thought about it carefully and said, 10,000 men. The generals looked at each other in bewilderment at the number. 10,000 men on each side meant that there was only a total of 30,000 men. How could they take down the Fortress of Resilience with such a military force and lineup? In spite of this, no one dared refute Han Sanhe's decision. The attack from 3 sides was instantaneous, charging forward like a swarm of bees. Seeing that Dongxuan's soldiers had charged all the way up the slope and were about to reach the top of the fort, Yutong's side finally made their move, releasing arrows in unison. Bucket after bucket of kerosene poured down like a river bursting its banks. The flaming arrows rained down like rain, meeting the pouring kerosene. The front of the Fortress of Resilience turned into a sea of fire at once, the flames billowing into the sky. In spite of this, Han Sanhe's gaze was calm as he watched the rising flames from afar. He smiled faintly and said, "I've been too careful in this attack. It looks like that old man Qiu Jianhan really doesn't have much kerosene left." Han Sanhe's words had a basis to them. The fire in front of the Fortress of Resilience was only burning fiercely at the beginning, but it only lasted for a moment before it gradually calmed down. Some of the places that were still burning were actually slowly extinguishing. What truly posed a threat to Dongxuan's soldiers was the sudden appearance of Yutong's soldiers. Their swords and sabers gleamed as they slaughtered their enemies. Now, it was Yutong and Dongxuan's long-awaited close-quarters combat, a head-on battle. As Dongxuan's troops charged in like a madman, a large number of Yutong's soldiers retaliated as well. The battle was unusually intense, but Dongxuan's army was only 30,000 men. Even when both sides were evenly matched, Yutong's side still had the home field advantage. Qiu Jianhan, whose white beard fluttered in the wind, stood at the top of the fort, directing the battle with his sword, tilting the battle in Yutong's favor. "Sound the gong," Han Sanhe ordered with a wave of his hand. There was no need to continue the battle. The 30,000 soldiers attacking this time was to test if the enemy still had a large amount of kerosene. Now that it had been proven, there was no need to continue the battle. "Tomorrow morning, we shall start cooking at 3 in the morning. We shall attack the fort at 5 in the morning. 120,000 men, attack only 2 sides." Han Sanhe ordered calmly, "Conquer the Fortress of Resilience in this battle and settle the situation." Yes. The generals understood the 30,000 men's intention to attack the fort today as well. Their morale was high, their voices roaring when they received the order. "Teacher?" Zhang Gu was still puzzled. "Why are you still surprised when everyone knows about it? Once I'm around, does your battlefield vanish into thin air? This is a bad habit." Han Sanhe was obviously in a good mood as he explained with a smile, "According to Yutong's reserves all these years, there must be a lot of kerosene that's necessary to defend the fort. Therefore, I've been depleting their kerosene these days. Even when the battle dragged on, I still didn't dare launch an all-out attack. After all, once we face the sea of fire made of kerosene, we'll suffer heavy casualties. In these days, Yutong has poured kerosene 6 times. The first time was the most. When it came to the 4th time, it was already mixed with water. The 5th time, the proportion of water was even higher. As for today's round, the proportion of water mixed in was already rather high. It's not even enough to cause enough damage. If it wasn't for Yutong's troops appearing at the top of the fort in time to launch a counterattack and that old man Qiu Jianhan's appearance to supervise the battle today, the 30,000 men might really have broken through the fort. All of this means that their reserve of kerosene has basically been depleted. Even if there's still some left, it's only a few. It doesn't affect the overall situation. Han Sanhe said, therefore, tomorrow is the time to launch an all-out attack. The entire army will press forward and take down the Fortress of Resilience in one fell swoop, clearing the path to Yutong once and for all. Zhang Gu asked, Teacher, could this be another tactic of Qiu Jianhan's to conceal the truth? Han Sanhe said faintly, of course there's such a possibility. I've never dared underestimate the old man, Qiu Jianhan. However, according to the storage of kerosene, Qiu Jianhan has already used at least 400,000 barrels of the actual kerosene that has been consumed these days. During this period of time, the number reported by more than 30 observation posts is 3 times higher than this number. I believe that the higher ones are all water. However, if we were to use this as the starting point, even if Yutong were to collect kerosene with all its might, the amount that could reach the Fortress of Resilience during this period of time would only be this much. That's 2 million barrels of kerosene. That's a joke. Even the entire Tianxian continent might not be able to gather so much. Chapter 491. Zhang Ji's heart skipped a beat. He could vaguely feel that perhaps his thoughts were true. His teacher might not be oblivious to it, but he still had to carry out his previous plan to the end. Early the next morning. The sky had yet to brighten. Dawn always came exceptionally late in winter. However, the deafening battle cries almost shattered the dark night. Dongshuan's main attack had finally begun. Within the Fortress of Resilience, Yutong's army, who had long been exhausted, rushed to the top of the fort at once. Right now, Qiu Jianhan was already skinny beyond recognition. This old marshal, who was already past his 70s, had been staying at the top of the fort all this time, standing amidst the thick smoke. There were a few times when he had fainted from the smoke. After all, the top of the fort was where the flames were the hottest. Even with a profound mystical skill to protect himself, it was still difficult for him to withstand the heat. However, he would rather be overwhelmed than take a step away from the top of the fort. How many of the enemy troops are participating in the main attack? Qiu Jianhan's voice was extremely hoarse. His eyes glowed like will-o'-the-wisps in the darkness. More than 100,000. Wang Dinghua had only roughly listened to the movements on the other end before he reported an accurate number. This was the military training of a veteran general. It was nothing. It's still too little. Qiu Jianhan sighed. However, this should be Han Sanhe's limit. This is the last harvest we can reap. Wang Dinghua stood straight. They will not be able to return alive. Use the rest of the kerosene for this battle. There's no need to keep any reserve. Pour it all down. Qiu Jianhan coughed violently and spat out a mouthful of phlegm tinged with blood. He said sternly, after pouring all the kerosene down, evacuate the fort quickly. According to the plan, head to the west gate for the final battle. Yes. Buckets of kerosene were poured down in an orderly manner. There were also teams of Yutong soldiers who charged down from the top of the fort amidst loud roars, charging into the sea of kerosene with their own bodies to engage the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. With the ice as a buffer, Yutong soldiers had an advantage as well. At least for now, they could leap down the fort without fear of injury. A total of 30,000 Yutong warriors charged out like frenzied tigers, fighting the enemy to the death amidst the flowing kerosene. The mentality of these Yutong warriors was different from Dongshuan's soldiers. Dongshuan's soldiers only knew that the enemy had gone mad and that this was the last fight to the death. As long as they could defeat them, it would be victory, it would be a smooth path forward and there would be no hindrance. Yutong's soldiers, on the other hand, knew very well that from the moment they had charged down, their lives were already on the countdown. Once the kerosene under their feet was completely poured, they would ignite into a raging inferno. At that time, be it himself or the enemy, they would all turn into a pile of charcoal. At this moment, no matter if he won or lost, he would definitely die. But they were still fearless. Follow me to hell. Dongxian brats. Ha ha ha. Ever since the 30,000 Yutong warriors had leaped down from the top of the city wall, they had formed an unprecedentedly powerful troop. Wielding their sabers and spears, they launched the strongest and most extreme counterattack, suppressing Dongxuan's 100,000 men and making it difficult for them to advance any further. Marshal, Yutong's troop has jumped down from the Fortress of Resilience to fight. How many of them have come? They are coming aggressively. The attack that my 100,000 men have been preparing has been stopped. Does this mean that the enemy has at least 50,000 men? Yes, there are even more. Han Sanhe paced around in silence and finally ordered, increase the troop by 80,000. Victory is imminent. In Dongxuan's formation, the beating of the war drums changed abruptly, resounding in a different manner. Under the illumination of the torch, Han Sanhe's expression was uncertain. Qiu Jianhan has always loved his soldiers like his own children. If it wasn't the last moment, such an extreme tactic would never appear. That means the bodies of Yutong's 30,000 warriors had turned into a new fortress of resilience on the slope that had been forged by both the enemy and their own. They charged forward in a frenzy, disregarding their own lives. At this moment, everything was no longer in their minds. Their parents, wives, children, lovers, brothers, friends, everything in the past, all flashed through their minds before they were tossed to the back of their minds. They had turned into a ferocious tiger that had descended the mountain with bloodshot eyes. A majestic voice resounded abruptly. Someone sprung up and hollered in midair. Yutong's warriors are here. Who dares invade our land? Who dares invade our land? All 30,000 warriors bellowed in unison and took 3 steps forward. We have no regrets in this life to enter Yutong. The fierce voice hollered. We have no regrets in this life to enter Yutong. The 30,000 warriors hollered. We forged the fortress with our iron bones. The fierce voice hollered. We forged the fortress with our iron bones. The fierce voice took another 3 steps forward. If there is a next life, let us fight. If there is a next life, let us fight. Sacrifice our bodies and bones to repay the country's kindness. Sacrifice our bodies and bones to repay the country's kindness. All 30,000 warriors howled into the sky like wolves. They charged forward without a care for their own safety and plunged into Dongxuan's formation. As they hollered, they fought with their lives on the line. Today, we face the national calamity. Why should we pity this body? If there is a next life, we are still Yutong's men. Saber light glinted as blood gushed into the sky. Countless warriors charged into the enemy's formation in the darkness before dawn. They killed the enemy and fell. The cycle repeated endlessly, as if they would not stop until they were dead. It was because of these people's sacrifice that the blood and corpses of countless Dongxian soldiers flowed into a small river on the ground. Yutong's soldiers at the top of the fort were still teary-eyed, but they were resolute as they poured the kerosene in buckets. Every Yutong soldier on the fort felt their blood burning intensely. They wanted very much to fight with their lives like the 30,000 warriors, but they could not. They still had the responsibility of pouring kerosene. Only when this last responsibility was completed could they talk about other things. On Dongxuan's side, the war drums were still beating loudly. Countless warriors charged up like the rising tide. At this point in the battle, only a few of the 30,000 warriors who had charged down the fort were left. Even the survivors were covered in wounds, but they were still fighting without retreating. A man who was drenched in blood roared into the sky, "Who can take a step forward before our grandfathers are all dead?" Ha ha ha. The warriors who were trapped in the enemy's formation guffawed in unison. That's right. Who can take a step forward before our grandfathers are all dead? Old Marshal, the accumulated kerosene has been poured. Wang Dinggua's tears flowed freely. Xiao Jianhan's expression was solemn. Wait a little longer. Wait until our warriors have all died in the battle. They shouldn't die in the sea of fire cast by our own people. This old man wants all of them to die on the battlefield. They must never die in the hands of our own people. Yes. Wang Dinggua and Xiao Jianhan stood at the highest point, watching the battle below closely. What they saw made them tremble, choking with sobs. The heroic cries from below grew fainter and fainter until they could no longer be heard. There were already Dongxian soldiers popping out from the top of the fort. Xiao Jianhan's eyes were ablaze. Suddenly, he roared with all his might, "Light the fire! Send our brothers off! Light the fire!" Wang Dinggua sprung up like a madman, the longbow in his hand pulled back into a full moon. The moment the fire arrow was ignited, it shot out swiftly. Light the fire! Countless Yutang soldiers were crying out loud with tears streaming down their faces. At the same time, countless fire arrows lit up the sky above the fortress of resilience. Send our brothers off! Boom! The fire that soared into the sky was ignited, the heat waves billowing. On the ground, the sticky kerosene that had been flowing everywhere lit up abruptly like wriggling fire dragons and soared into the sky, burning fiercely like never before. The front line of Dongxuan's hundreds of thousands of soldiers had already charged up to the top of Yutang's fort, but the ones at the back, or rather, most of the soldiers, were still on the slope, advancing swiftly. The moment the fire suddenly ignited, it spread at an unimaginable and unbelievable speed, instantly burning to the other end of the gentle slope. This also meant that the hundreds of thousands of Dongxuan soldiers who had launched the attack were trapped in the sea of fire at the same time. Chapter 492. The sudden raging fire separated the armies of the two countries. At the same time, a deafening roar erupted from the top of the fortress of resilience. It was a roar of joy. It was a roar of farewell to their comrades. Brothers, do you see this? All of you did not die in vain. These hundreds of thousands of Dongxian soldiers are all buried with you. They are all sacrifices that our brothers have sent to you. We shall not go to the underworld alone, we shall walk together with the enemy. Wang Dinggua howled into the sky, hot tears rolling down his cheeks. Xiao Jianhan's lips trembled as tears streamed down his cheeks. Why should I hesitate to sacrifice my body to face the national crisis today? I am a man of Yutang in life and a soul of Yutang in death. If there's a next life, I shall be a brave warrior again, strengthen Yutang's heart, and be Yutang's army again. Brothers, all of you are great. I, Xiao Jianhan, have no regrets in dying without regrets to be able to fight with all of you in this lifetime. To be able to die with all of you is even more honorable, an honor indeed. I hope that all of you will wait for me. When this old man deals a heavy blow to Han Sanha at the west gate, I shall reunite with all of you. The road to the underworld is long, there are many enemies accompanying us. How can we lack a leader? Millions of loyal souls should still be here, the army of the underworld is still in formation. Only waiting for this old man to sound the war drums and slaughter all of Dongxuan's souls. Xiao Jianhan hollered, "Retreat! Retreat at full speed!" Wang Dinggua let out a long howl. Countless Yutang soldiers retreated from the top of the fort like a receding tide. Xiao Jianhan mounted his horse and did not look back. Leave the fort. Behind him, the fire burned thousands of feet into the sky. The entire top of the Fortress of Resilience was already in shambles, the outermost part of the outer wall had already been burnt to a crisp. The Fortress of Resilience that had been renowned throughout the world for decades, known as an impregnable fortress, could no longer live up to its name and no longer existed. Amidst the fire, the struggles of the hundreds of thousands of Dongxian soldiers grew weaker until only the crackling sound of burning could be heard. A fire that had been set up for many days, had actually cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of Dongxian soldiers. On the other side, Yutong's soldiers retreated from the top of the wall at a frightening speed, one after the other, like specters. In an extremely short time, the Fortress of Resilience was empty, it was like an empty city. Qiu Jianhan led the last 50,000 men out of the city in a single file. There were so many of them, but they did not make any noise at all. Even the fluttering flags were neat and tidy, without the slightest bit of disorder. Many soldiers carried a military flag, their heads held high and their chests puffed out. However, there was no one else beside him. There should have been a few hundred or even a few thousand people under the flag, but now there was only one person left. He carried the tattered flag with his head held high and chest puffed out. It was as if his brothers had never left. They were still in the formation, accompanying him as he marched silently. He was still here, the flag was still here, how could the brothers who stood under this flag not be here? This kind of military flag could be seen everywhere among the troops leaving the city. A soldier, holding the military flag high, was clearly bleeding from his chest, and his injuries were severe. In spite of this, he continued to march forward with his head held high, his chest puffed out, as if he did not feel anything. The brothers beside him wanted to help out of goodwill, but they were glared at by the soldier. "My brother, I am the only one who can carry our banner. Only I can carry it, it means that there are still people in our formation. We don't need help." The sound of footsteps and hooves rang in the empty Fortress of Resilience, eliciting echoes. It was as if there were millions of Yutong's loyal souls marching out of the fortress in a neat formation, waiting for the moment of a battle to the death. Looking at the fire that had suddenly erupted in front of him, Han Sanhe's face flushed as a gush of blood rushed to his head, causing him to feel dizzy. Spat. Han Sanhe spat out a mouthful of blood, his eyes glaring as he said, "Qiu Jianhan, how vicious you are." No one, including Han Sanhe, had expected that the 30,000 Yutong warriors who had charged down the fort and launched a counterattack at the last moment was actually Qiu Jianhan's plan to lure the enemy, to seize the opportunity to attack. He had used tens of thousands of Yutong's loyal souls as bait, as an opportunity to allow Dongxuan's troops to attack without worry, but in the end, he had lost 180,000 Dongxian elites. Even Han Sanhe could not have expected such a move. Like Zhang Gu, Han Sanhe had also considered that Qiu Jianhan might have hidden a certain amount of kerosene in case of an emergency, but he had never expected that Qiu Jianhan, who was known to love his soldiers like his own children, would actually go to such extremes and break convention. Zhang Gu, who was watching from the side, felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the tragic scene. If he were in Qiu Jianhan's shoes, he would never have used such a desperate tactic. Tens of thousands of his men were still fighting with their lives on the line, while the rear was pouring kerosene endlessly. With a big fire, the enemy and his comrades were all turned into ashes. The plan was ruthless and merciless. Just like what Han Sanhe had said, it was truly vicious. This is the most resolute Qiu Jianhan has ever been since he became a marshal. Han Sanhe spat out a mouthful of blood, his face pale and defeated, but his agitated emotions had already calmed down. He said softly as he wiped away the blood at the corner of his mouth with his sleeve. Right now, there was only solemn respect in his eyes, there was no resentment at all. I've always thought that Qiu Jianhan is inferior to me when it comes to military strategy. The reason is because he's less ruthless than I am. Less ruthless and merciless. I never thought that it would be Qiu Jianhan who taught me a lesson at the last moment. This old man is ashamed. Han Sanhe closed his eyes softly. It's not that Qiu Jianhan isn't ruthless, it's not that he can't be hateful. It's just that no one has ever been able to force him to this extent. Call a truce for now, retreat. Han Sanhe ordered, when the fire dies down, the fortress of resilience will be ours. Since Qiu Jianhan has made such an arrangement, it means that he no longer cares about the fortress of resilience. We, on the other hand, have to prepare for Qiu Jianhan's duel of life and death the moment we exit the fortress of resilience. Yun Yang was burning with anxiety. He was less than 300 miles away from the fortress of resilience now. It was difficult for him to advance any further. The current time limit was already a few days past the time he had agreed on with the village youths. In fact, he had been trapped here for a few days already. In front of the mountain, there were thousands of corpses strewn all over the place. There were more than 100 superb cultivators lying in ambush on the mountain, each of them an expert among experts. Anyone who passed by would be intercepted and killed. Whether they were martial artists who had rushed to the front line, civilians who had joined the army, or passers-by, they were not spared. It was better to kill 1,000 innocents than to let a single person off. Yun Yang had tried to take a detour from another direction several times, but he was intercepted without exception. His injuries had healed now, other than feeling slightly weak, he was fine. However, even with his Heaven Realm cultivation base, he could not make it through. He had even been injured a few times and was almost killed in the forest. Whether it was a detour or a head-on charge, none of them worked. The enemies lying in ambush were like a nail wedged here. Yun Yang had long recognized who the enemies in front of him were. They were led by the Four Seasons Tower's four venerable lords. Other than the four venerable lords, there were other experts as well, all of them top-notch experts of the Four Seasons Tower. They seemed to have sensed something and had set up a death trap in the midst of the mountains. They could not be sure which one was Supreme Cloud, so what they had done was to prevent anyone from passing through. Even a bird would not be able to fly over. It was these people who had intercepted Yun Yang here. He knew that time was running out and that the Fortress of Resilience could not hold out much longer, but he had been stopped right here. Yun Yang was almost on fire. If he were to turn around and advance from another path, he would have to go around dozens of mountains and take a detour to the north, then charge through from the north. However, if he did so, he would need at least half a month's time, even if he had the fastest horse in the world. If he were to drag this on for another half a month, everything would be over by then. Yun Yang had been disguising himself in an attempt to break through, but he could not do so no matter what. It was as if the target of the interception was not a specific target, but, as long as you passed through here, you would not be able to pass. A radius of hundreds of miles was shrouded in deific consciousness. In the truest sense, the living were not allowed to enter, those who trespassed would die. Who knew how many experts the Four Seasons Tower had sent out this time to create such a crazy effect? What surprised Yun Yang the most was that there were a few spiritual restraining formations set up in the surrounding mountains. The targets were clearly set up to deal with the 9 Supremes. Chapter 493. Yun Yang did not want to expose his identity. After discovering the spiritual restraining formation, he left his horse aside and attempted to break through the barrier alone. However, despite repeated attempts, he could not break through. In spite of this, the Four Seasons Tower's men were shocked. They did not know where this blood-stained fellow had come from. His movements were strange and unpredictable, a slight misstep would cause them to suffer. It was fortunate that this fellow's cultivation base was slightly weaker. Otherwise, they would not have been able to stop him. Out of options, Yun Yang made up his mind and retreated dozens of miles back. He turned into a righteous one and resumed his disguise as the capital city's young Master Yun. Yun Yang, the young Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, rushing to the Fortress of Resilience as reinforcements. He had planned to keep his identity a secret because Yun Yang was worried that his identity would be restored when he went over. However, if he went over and his 9 Supreme's abilities were suddenly restored when the situation was critical, Supreme Cloud's sudden arrival at the Fortress of Resilience would be an unexpected visit. However, the number of experts who had gone over during this period of time was very limited. With a little thought, he could confirm that this young Master Yun Yang was Supreme Cloud. Then, he would have no secrets to speak of with the Four Seasons Tower. However, Yun Yang was anxious after failing to cross the barrier multiple times, so he did not care anymore. He would think about the future when it came. He might not be able to restore the 9 Supreme's abilities immediately. No matter what, he had to cross the barrier first. Yun Yang, who had reverted to his previous appearance, was dressed in purple, his hair tied up with a purple jade crown. His face was as bright as the moon, his eyes long and brows long, his hair fluttering in the wind. A long saber hung from his waist and a magnificent crimson horse galloped along the way. Young Master Yun was like a jade and his horse was like a dragon. Reddy galloped all the way, jumping 100 feet in a single leap. Dozens of miles were covered in a snap of a finger. In the blink of an eye, the man and the horse had arrived before the mountain. Yun Yang seemed to be completely unaware of the strong obstacle blocking the way as he continued to gallop forward, his speed increasing instead of slowing down. It was as if the situation was urgent and urgent. At this moment, a sword light shone from the dense forest, falling like a cloud of mist, filled with a chilling murderous intent. Yun Yang seemed to be shocked, but he did not panic. As he counterattacked with his saber, he sprung up and hollered, "Who is it?" As soon as he made his move, Merciless Blade had already been unleashed as he launched a fierce counterattack. It was unknown whether the attacker had seen Yun Yang's appearance or he had some impression of Merciless Blade's unique skill, but he exclaimed in surprise, "Yun Yang?" It was obvious that the other party was surprised to see Yun Yang. Yun Yang was even more surprised. Venerable Lord Frost? Suddenly, someone appeared from the forest. He was dressed in a long robe of frost and snow, his gaze was like cold lightning. It was Venerable Lord Frost, one of the 4 remaining Venerable Lords of the Four Seasons Tower. He was looking at Yun Yang in surprise as well. Yun Yang's strike had missed, he had lost his momentum due to the misuse of his strength, causing him to fall from the sky. He yelled angrily, "Venerable Lord Frost, why is the Four Seasons Tower so persistent? Are all your words mere farts?" Venerable Lord Frost said angrily, "Why are we haunting you? Who are you saying is just farting? Watch your mouth." Yun Yang was even more enraged. "If you're not haunting me, why are you blocking my way? If your words aren't mere farts, why are you trying to kill me? The promise from that day is still fresh in my ears. You're the one who attacked first, and now you're complaining that my mouth isn't clean." Venerable Lord Frost froze and only spoke after a while, "How would I know it was you?" "What? You didn't know it was me? You attacked without seeing the target clearly? Who are you trying to fool?" Yun Yang said, "Forget it. I'm busy now, I don't have time to bicker with you. I'm only asking you, do you know it's me now? Why aren't you moving? Do you really want your words to be like a fart?" Venerable Lord Frost said, "Not even if it's you. I can't let you pass now." Yun Yang said angrily, "Pfft. Are you going to go back on your words now? Did the 4 Venerables really mean what they said? Tell me, what do you want to do to me? You're strong after all. No matter what you want to do, I can only accept it." Venerable Lord Frost looked embarrassed as he mumbled to defend himself, "I didn't say I want to do anything to you. I just can't let you pass. This has to be done. It's not that we intentionally broke the promise. That's all." Yun Yang snorted coldly, looking like he was suppressing his anger as he said in a low voice, "Venerable Lord Frost, we've met once, haven't we? I've saved Venerable Lord Sword's life that day in exchange for the promise between us. It's not just a one-sided promise from the Four Seasons Tower. You've broken the promise and blocked my way. Shouldn't you at least explain to me what's going on? Venerable Lord Frost said coldly, I'm merely following orders to seal off this road. Anyone who's alive on this road heading towards the northeast is to be intercepted. There are no exceptions, trespassers shall die. The fact that you're still alive is already due to the fate of that fateful day. Be content with what you have. Yunyang sighed helplessly and said, all right, all right. The Four Seasons Tower has always been domineering, sealing the road as you wish. Blocking my way is still giving me face. Can't I be content with what I have? However, I still want to ask you something. Does Venerable Lord Frost still remember the conditions that the Four Seasons Tower has promised me? Does it still count? Venerable Lord Frost answered, of course. Of course it does. Otherwise, you'd be a dead man by now. Yunyang said angrily, it's good that it counts. I remember one of the conditions saying that we'll all mind our own business from now on. The Four Seasons Tower, in particular, is not to look for trouble with me on your own accord. Is that not what it says? Venerable Lord Frost chuckled and said, there is indeed such a condition, but it's not the Four Seasons Tower who's looking for trouble with you. It's you who's looking for trouble with us. Yunyang hollered, nonsense. You can't stop farting, can you? I'm going to assist the Eastern Front and I have the Imperial Edict with me. There's no time to lose. It's obvious that you're trying to sabotage our country's grand plan by blocking my way here. How dare you say that I'm the one who's looking for trouble? How preposterous. Do you really feel guilty about making irresponsible remarks like this? Venerable Lord Frost knew that he was in the wrong and said faintly, no matter what you say, I can't let you pass. Not killing you is already my limit. Yunyang said as if he was about to vomit blood, all right. I know who you're waiting for here. I also know what you're trying to do here. But what does this have to do with me? What's the use of you stopping me? I think you're looking for trouble with me on purpose, aren't you? Venerable Lord Frost snorted. You know who we're waiting for? Yunyang said angrily, you're still being stubborn? Who in this world doesn't know that your sole purpose of waiting here is to stop Supreme Wind? Do I have to spell it out when it's so obvious? Don't tell me you think that there's something fishy and mysterious about this matter? Venerable Lord Frost snorted and did not speak anymore. It was obvious that he had realized that this matter was not worth debating. It was the truth, but those who had met him previously had been killed along the way. There was no room to think about anything else. Let's say that if it was someone you don't know, you could have stopped him and killed him. It's not that your luck is too bad. But who am I? I'm Yunyang, the young Marquis of Heavenly Clouds. Am I Supreme Wind? I have no intention of spoiling your plans, nor have I provoked you, especially when we've had many dealings, but you still want to do this? Isn't that too unfair? Let's put it this way. I'll only ask you one thing, am I Lord Supreme Wind? Am I the target of your ambush? Yunyang's face was earnest and sincere. Nonsense. Venerable Lord Frost rolled his eyes and said angrily, your words are as good as fart. Yunyang spat blood and said, answer my question. Am I Supreme Wind? Say it. Venerable Lord Frost looked impatient. Of course you're not Supreme Wind. Otherwise, how could you be allowed to live until now? This old man would have killed you long ago. After yesterday's update, the whole family had New Year's dinner. I drank with the old man and in the end, I was actually made drunk by the old man. Chapter 494. Yunyang spread his arms and said as if he was about to vomit blood, that's right. You're sure that I'm not Lord Supreme Wind, aren't you? Indeed. Since you're sure, why don't you make way for me to pass? Yunyang looked like he was about to cry again. We're all old acquaintances. Can we stop fooling around? Venerable Lord Frost scratched his head and thought for a moment, thinking that what Yun Yang said made sense. We're waiting for Supreme Wind. To ensure our safety, we have to annihilate everyone who passes by here. We'd rather kill them than let them go unpunished because they could all be Supreme Wind. However, there was someone whom Venerable Lord Frost knew very well, someone who was not Supreme Wind. Was it really necessary to stop him from passing? However, the order they had received was, no matter who it was, even if it was a dog or an ant, as long as it was a living thing, they were not allowed to pass through. If there was an intruder, no matter who it was, they were to kill without mercy. Even if Yun Yang was definitely not Supreme Wind and was someone they knew, he was still within the ban. So, should he let them go or not? Venerable Lord Frost could not make up his mind, hesitating and hesitating. Military intelligence is like a raging fire. Yun Yang said anxiously, Venerable Lord Frost, can you please be merciful? At most, I'll treat you to a drink when you guys come to Tiantang City again. Venerable Lord Frost rolled his eyes and said subconsciously, who cares about your wine? How can you say that? Yun Yang was furious. Why don't you say that? How can you stop me? You know that I'm not your target, yet you're still arguing here. Will you only let me go if I'm so angry that I'm going to vomit blood? You guys have agreed to this condition. How can the Four Seasons Tower be so shameless? Is this the bearing of the Four Seasons Tower that rules the world? Yun Yang looked like he was about to die from grief and indignation. He was probably thinking about what Venerable Lord Frost would do to him. Venerable Lord Frost hesitated again and finally said, forget it. Wait for a while. I'll find Sword to talk to you. He'll speak first. There's no need to search. We're all here. The voice was like a long sword being unsheathed. It was Venerable Lord Sword. Supreme Sword looked much thinner than when they had last met in Tiantang City. At the same time, he looked much more somber as well. The man's gaze towards Yun Yang was exceptionally unfriendly. Of course, there was a reason for this man's attitude towards Yun Yang. He had been inflicted with Yun Yang's blood coagulation poison, which had caused his body to be crippled to a certain extent. Any man would not be friendly towards anyone related to this matter. Beside Venerable Lord Sword, there were Venerable Lord Snow, Venerable Lord Ice, and another 5 to 6 people whom Yun Yang did not know. All of them had hidden their abilities well and their cultivation base was incredibly high. There was no doubt that they were the Four Seasons Tower's top experts. Venerable Lord Sword is here too? Nice to meet you. Yun Yang said angrily, the Four Seasons Tower is so heartless and goes back on your words. How can you stand in the martial world? Venerable Lord Frost is one thing, but you, Venerable Lord Sword, have been saved by me before. The past is still vivid in my mind, but now you're going back on your words. How infuriating. Venerable Lord Sword was so furious that his lungs were about to explode when he uttered those words. What do you mean by saving my life? If it wasn't for your mischief and poison the other time, how could I have been injured? How could I be crippled? How could I not be able to lift my head up until now? Nonsense. Venerable Lord Sword snorted coldly. Yun Yang, this isn't Tiantang City. We've promised not to make things difficult for you in Tiantang City, but here, we're not restricted. Yun Yang smirked. Impressive, impressive. He was indeed a shameless person. How dare you play word games with me? Venerable Lord Sword, you really shouldn't be hanging around in the martial world. You should be an official in the imperial court. Who knows if what you're saying is real or just bullsh*t. To think that such shameless words could come out of Venerable Lord Sword's mouth in such a dignified manner. I'm utterly impressed. It's truly an eye-opener for me. I'm utterly impressed to the point of prostrating myself before you. Venerable Lord Sword said coldly, Yun Yang, your words are so filthy. Do you really think that my sword can't kill? You're the one who provoked me first, you're the one who's provoked me first. Yun Yang mocked, whether your sword can kill or not has nothing to do with me. I'll only ask the four of you one thing now, one thing. Today, are you going to make way for us or not? Speak quickly. Venerable Lord Ice spoke for the first time, so what if we make way? So what if we don't? Yun Yang snorted and said, what do you mean, what do you mean? If you make way, I'll go and do what I want to do. Do you think I can still build a house and live here? On the other hand, if you don't make way, this young master won't waste any more words. I'll turn around and take a detour. It's just a matter of time, it's not a big deal. Venerable Lord Ice said coldly, there's still a next, isn't there? Yun Yang gritted his teeth and said, of course there's a next. You've all given me a peach, of course I have to return the favor. I, Yun Yang, am an insignificant character. Of course, I have to help you spread the word about how the Four Seasons Tower is true to its word and how it keeps its promise. How you can't even acknowledge what you've promised them. It's truly worthy of the world's top sect. It's truly Mr. Nian's sect, it's only to spread your names. It's the hardest business of mine, I'll help you all spread your names from morning till night. You'll be known by the world overnight. I'm still very confident. These are the facts that I've experienced personally. Isn't it convincing enough? Venerable Lord Ice hollered coldly, what a sharp tongue, child. Yun Yang was unfazed. You venerable lords can't even abide by the heaven's vow you've made. What does it matter if I say a few more words? Right, my words carry little weight. Even if what I say is the truth, not many will believe it. How about I ask His Majesty the Emperor to issue a royal edict to help you spread the word after I return? That should be credible enough, right? The people beside him were experts of the Four Seasons Tower as well. Upon hearing his words, they asked in confusion, what have you all promised? Do you have to be bullied by a child like this? The muscles on Venerable Lord Frost's face twitched as he recounted what had happened earlier in a low voice. The rest of them shut their mouths at once. In the martial world, words were spoken like the wind. Keeping one's word was the most basic creed, not to mention that it was the heaven's vow they had made that day. However, if they were to let him pass, how would they explain it to their lord? The situation was at a stalemate. Yun Yang, who had waited quietly for a moment, suddenly snorted and turned to leave. Forget it. Continue blocking the way, I'll take a detour. A shameless man is indeed invincible. I've witnessed the Four Seasons Tower's glory today, to the very end. What a trustworthy man. Wait. Venerable Lord Sword hollered coldly, it's not impossible if you want to pass. However, there's a condition that must be made clear. Yun Yang turned around. What condition? Speak quickly, speak quickly. This young master is busy, I have no time to waste with you. Venerable Lord Sword stepped forward with his sword in hand. The martial world's affairs shall be decided by our fists. As long as you can defeat the sword in my hand, I'll let you pass. Isn't this a fair condition? Yun Yang guffawed when he heard what Venerable Lord Sword had to say. It was only after a while that his laughter gradually subsided. Venerable Lord Sword, your challenge is really not classy enough. Why don't you call that Mr. Nian out as well and gather all the experts of the Four Seasons Tower? I'll fight all of you alone. If I win, I'll pass. Isn't that even better? The Four Seasons Tower's experts were flushed, speechless for a moment. Venerable Lord Sword, senior expert, can you still be so shameless? Yun Yang spat and squinted at Venerable Lord Sword, speaking in a sarcastic tone, Venerable Lord Sword, you're also a reputable figure in the world. How dare you say that you want to challenge me, a mere 18.5 years old? What a heroic move, what a heroic bearing. If I win, I'll be able to go over. What a generous condition. Venerable Lord Sword's pale face flushed crimson. Yun Yang's tongue was as sharp as a knife, each word cutting into one's heart. If I can defeat you, Venerable Lord Sword, I'll just fight my way through. Is there a need to waste so much time talking to you? Yun Yang was still jabbering incessantly. All right, you're not giving way, are you? Not giving way, are you? I'll ask again, not giving way, are you? Fine, I'll go. I'll leave now, goodbye. He turned to leave after he said that. With a whistle, Reddy galloped over from afar. Yun Yang leaped onto the horse and muttered to himself, "Pfft. Top expert of the top sect? You know we're not acquaintances, yet you're doing this and that. You don't even want a little bit of shamelessness. What's there for your father to say? Your father won't entertain you anymore. Go. Wait." Venerable Lord Snow frowned for a long time before he finally waved his hand. "Young Master Yun, you don't have to scold us like this. We'll let you pass. However, after today, we don't owe each other any more." Chapter 495. Yun Yang snorted, but his expression was unforgiving as he said, "What are you talking about? What are you talking about? Whatever the initial promise is, it's what it is. What right do you have to let me go and we don't owe each other anything? I won't agree to it, anyone with a brain wouldn't agree to it. I really don't know if you're too smart or too stupid to actually come up with such a ridiculous argument. If you really want to be punished by heaven, continue to agree to the idea that we don't owe each other anything and see how heavens will judge it. What's the saying? Good and evil will always be reincarnated, who will heaven spare? The Four Seasons Tower is so domineering, maybe heaven's punishment won't be directed at you. Why don't you try it? The four venerable ones were so angry that one Buddha was born and two Buddhas were in nirvana. The order we received was that the living were not to enter and those who trespassed would die. Not only did we not kill you, we even let you pass. This is already a great favor, all right? It's enough to sever the previous karma. Yet, this child was still so unforgiving. He really did not know what was good for him. However, the four venerable lords could not do anything to him. Back then, he had indeed made this promise. If he was willing to return the favor unilaterally, it was only his own business. If the other party didn't agree to it, then it wouldn't be over. He had his own reasons and freedom, and there was no way to argue about this. What do you think? I'm right, aren't I? At the end of the day, you all owe me. Even if you let me pass, you still owe me. Farewell. Yun Yang continued to grumble as he mounted his horse with an indignant expression. With a whistle, he galloped away. The sound of the horse's hooves was like a storm as it traveled far away, galloping towards the direction of the Fortress of Resilience. The Four Seasons Tower's men looked at each other, feeling fortunate that their stomachs had yet to explode. Those experts who had never been to Tiantang City were glaring at Venerable Lord Sword and the other three Venerable Lords with angry eyes. For Venerable Lords, what is going on today? Can you be any more ridiculous? That's right, we've been scolded for no reason at all, but we can't even talk back. This has really broadened our horizons. Why did you guys make such a vow when you had nothing better to do? Do you have nothing better to do? Today is really frustrating. I've never been so frustrated in my entire life. It's just a kid who's still wet behind the ears. This is really infuriating. This is the first time in my life that I've swallowed my anger and humiliation, and it's because of a junior. Everyone expressed their dissatisfaction, very dissatisfaction. You have no idea. Venerable Lord Snow heaved a long sigh. There was a reason for it back then. Our lives were hanging by a thread. We had no choice but to compromise. Sigh, if it wasn't for the lives of our brothers, who would be willing to do this? Do you think we're willing to do this today? Venerable Lord Frost held his breath and said, I have to say, this kid is really a weirdo. He's obviously from a noble family, the heir of a royal family, yet he won't let go of someone else's weakness. You keep talking about what you've promised, what you've promised, what you've promised, what you've said. You've been relentlessly pursuing and pestering him. It's really unfortunate to meet someone like this. Venerable Lord Ice continued coldly, it looks like you've missed something in this child's information. It's true that he's from a noble family, the heir of a royal family, but he also has a popular nickname, the head of the 3 popinjays in Tiantang City. His reputation is not just for show. Such a popinjay's temperament is true to his name. If we cross paths again in the future, I'm afraid similar situations will be unavoidable. The people around him looked at each other and said, huh? Does this mean that the 4 Seasons Towers people will have to avoid him in the future when they see him? Otherwise, we'll have to be threatened by him? Venerable Lord Frost sighed. Venerable Lord Snow sighed. The group was speechless. What the F***ck is this? Even Ling Xiaozue has never been treated like this. Yun Yang galloped all the way, inwardly rejoicing that he had finally passed this hurdle. Apart from rejoicing, there was only anxiety in his heart. Fortress of Resilience, Old Marshal Chiu, Fu Baogua, you must hang in there. Fu Baogua, you swore to live and die with the Fortress of Resilience that day. You must fulfill your vow. You've made a solemn promise to me, you can't go back on your word. Reddy and Yun Yang were one, as if they were one entity. Both the man and the steed were like a bolt of red lightning, traversing the mountains and ridges in the forest like they were on flat ground. A single leap covered hundreds of feet. The occasional passers-by who saw the steed a moment ago had already overtaken them in the next, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Reddy had really given its all now. Its movement and speed were even better than when it was in the Horse King tournament. It seemed to feel Yun Yang's anxiety as it galloped with all its might. However, the ominous feeling in Yun Yang's heart did not diminish at all. It was impossible to get rid of. Before his eyes, there seemed to be the smoke of war and the sound of war. As long as he turned the corner of the mountain pass, the place that Yun Yang hated the most in his life would be right in front of him. Tianxian Cliff. In spite of this, Yun Yang's eyes widened as he swayed, almost falling off his horse. Looking from afar, thick smoke billowed into the sky like dark clouds that covered the sky. Yun Yang, who had been through the battlefield for a long time, could tell at a glance that such billowing smoke could only appear when the city was breached. It was the black smoke that signified the determination to perish together with the enemy. Such a scene had always been a bad omen on the battlefield, a manifestation of the most extreme situation. After galloping another 30 miles, the deafening battle cries could gradually be heard. Yun Yang leaned on the steed and exerted more force, charging out of the valley like a whirlwind. The other side was already in a state of melancholy, the sun and moon losing their luster. Crimson red filled his vision. In front of him was a vast plain that spanned thousands of miles. At this very moment, countless soldiers from both sides were committing suicide. Everywhere he looked, there were people, there were soldiers everywhere. What was left was only the color of blood. Yun Yang could not help sucking in a sharp breath as he watched the current state of the battle, his heart filled with shock. Yutong had been at war all year round, surrounded by enemies from all sides. They had been at war for far too many years. Since Yutong's 9 Supremes had appeared, they had gone through many battles. Despite Yun Yang's young age, he had been through hundreds of battles and had been on the battlefield for a long time. However, it was the first time in his life that Yun Yang had encountered a war of such scale and intensity. How could a massive battle involving more than 1 million people, close to 2 million people, be taken lightly? As the saying went, when there were tens of thousands of people, there was no end to it. What if there were hundreds of thousands or millions of people? Looking from the top of the mountain, one could not see the end of it. One could only see the silhouettes in the distance getting smaller and smaller, turning into a blurry mass. However, the battle on the other side was still extremely intense, not at all inferior to what could be seen clearly here. There was only one word to describe this battle: extreme. It was the most extreme battle of the century. If another word had to be used, it could only be, this is the final battle. The ultimate battle. Yun Yang's heart tightened as he thought of this, urging his steed forward once more. It was not that Yun Yang had forgotten that he had lost his manifestation powers and that his mystical cultivation base had yet to recover to its peak, but he could no longer hesitate or worry about anything else. As a member of the Empire of Yutong, he could only throw himself into the battlefield without hesitation. He would have no regrets in doing so. Yun Yang could clearly see that the side that had the absolute advantage now was Dongxuan's army, led by Han Sanhe. The ones who had built the defense line hastily and were holding on bitterly were Yutong's soldiers who would rather die than retreat. At this moment, the situation had reached the most critical juncture. Yun Yang's steed galloped like a gust of wind. Just as he was about to step onto the battlefield, a deafening roar came from within the formation. The roar was filled with grief and indignation. Yun Yang, who had heard the roar, felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. Suddenly, he saw stars and fell off his horse with a loud thud, rolling a dozen times in a row. It was an extremely embarrassing fall. There was no other reason for it, only because the soldiers were howling in grief and indignation. Kill all of Dongxuan's traitors, avenge the old marshal. Old marshal. Qiu Jianhan. Yun Yang, who heard the words, was immediately thrown into a panic. In the Empire of Yutong, there had always been only one person who could be addressed as Old Marshal. Only Qiu Jianhan. There was no branch, no home. What had happened to the Old Marshal? Yun Yang, who had heard the grievous news, was horrified. He felt as if his soul had flown out of his body, stumbling 2 steps on the ground before he regained his consciousness. If Yun Yang had already entered the battlefield, this moment of absent-mindedness would have been enough for him to die 17 or 18 times over. Despite the shock, Yun Yang still held on to a sliver of hope. Leaping onto his steed, he charged towards the army without a care in the world. He only had one thought now: to charge over as fast as he could and ask about the situation on the other side of the formation, hoping that the old marshal was blessed with good fortune and had survived the mishap. Although there was still no news of Emmy, there was still a great chance that he could save the old marshal's life with his endless divine art. Yun Yang truly did not want to lose a close elder who cared for him. Yun Yang knew that he would not be able to withstand the repeated deaths. Get out of the way. Yun Yang, who had entered the battlefield, did not hesitate at all, activating his Heaven Realm cultivation base. Those who came close to him were either flung away with internal injuries or killed on the spot. The King of Horses, ready, seemed to feel Yun Yang's urgency as well. Its already swift speed was raised to another level as it charged forward. The man and the horse were like a miniature fortress as they charged forward. For a moment, no one could stop them. It only took a moment for Yun Yang to advance more than 5,000 feet. On the other side of the formation, Fu Baoguo's silhouette entered Yun Yang's sight. This Yutong's marshal, who was closely related to Yun Yang, was standing in the wooden bucket on the flagpole, shouting with all his might. As he commanded the battle, he deflected the rain of arrows with the long sword in his hand. There was another person beside him. Yun Yang was surprised to see that it was Fang Mafei, who was wielding the sword in his hand to protect Fu Baoguo as he sent precise orders. Fu Baoguo seemed to have lost his mind. Commanding the battle from such a conspicuous position was no different from seeking death. If it were not for Fang Mafei's protection, he would have become a human-shaped porcupine long ago. However, Yun Yang could no longer care about Fu Baoguo's current condition. He, who had already charged into the battlefield, needed to change his strategy. He could no longer charge forward with his powerful mystical qi cultivation base. What he had done earlier was indeed invincible, but the consumption was too high and it was not conducive to a protracted battle. Yun Yang charged into the thousands of soldiers and horses. Suddenly, he extended his arm and snatched the long saber from a Dongxian general's hand. With a wave of the saber, a dozen Dongxian soldiers around him fell to the ground with agonized cries. Actually, Yun Yang had wanted to use weapons right from the start. If he had Heaven's Blade as a supplement, he could have easily charged into the battlefield and killed more enemies. However, Heaven's Blade was missing just like Emmy, making it difficult for him to participate in this battle. The red horse continued to gallop forward at an extremely fast speed without stopping. Far away, a troop of soldiers was surrounded by a large number of Dongxian soldiers. They were charging forward like mad tigers, but they could not break through Dongxuan's heavy siege. Dongxuan's soldiers were surrounding them from all directions, trying their best to devour Yutong's soldiers. On the other side, Yutong's cavalry was also charging forward like a madman, but they were forcefully intercepted by Dongxuan's shadow cavalry, who were fearless of death. If one were to say that the previous battle situation was already exceptionally tragic, then the current level of devastation was actually 2 levels higher. Save the old marshal. Avenge the old marshal. Charge over. Fu Baogua hollered like a thunderbolt in the clear sky, charge. Charge over. You must help me get the old marshal out. Yun Yang was overjoyed, knowing that old Marshal Qiu Jianhan was still alive at this moment. It was not too late. Don't be late, wait for me to rush over. Thinking about it, Yun Yang subconsciously diverted at least 30% of his attention to the commotion over there. There was a faint white silhouette circling rapidly, charging forward. Wherever the white silhouette passed, Dongxuan's soldiers fell in batches and batches. There was no one who could withstand the white silhouette. Wherever the silhouette passed, blood splattered like it was free. In spite of this, the space he had just cleared was instantly filled with Dongxuan's troops once again. It was Bai Yixue who was already one of the world's pinnacle experts. It was obvious that the old marshal was still alive because of Bai Yixue's protection. If it were not for such a strong support, the old marshal would have long passed away. In spite of Bai Yixue's unparalleled prowess, unstoppable on the battlefield and able to take on an army of 1,000, it was still impossible for him to bring the old marshal out safely. Bai Yixue! Yun Yang roared when he saw the situation. Bai Yixue had been fighting for a long time and was about to reach his limit. If his mystical qi was depleted to its limit, he would not be able to escape death even with his profound cultivation base. Yet, when he heard the roar, he was energized as he hollered, "Young master! I'm here!" The sword light, which had been gradually dimming and converging, suddenly surged and soared into the sky. Then, a sword light fell from the sky, directly killing all the enemies within a radius of 10 feet. However, this moment of glory was still unable to intimidate the enemies, and in a moment, they were drowned by the tide of people. This gap was enough for Yun Yang to ascertain his direction. With another roar, he waved the saber in his hand and hollered, "Those who stand in my way shall die." Clamping his legs on the horse's abdomen, Reddy let out a long neigh and charged out like a ray of red light along with its horse. Before the red light was the saber energy of the saber that had also turned into a cold gleam. Leveraging on the horse's momentum, the man charged into the steel cavalry's formation in no time at all. The steel cavalry was engaged in an intense battle with the shadow cavalry when they heard the sound of a horn behind them. It was an order to split up and make way for them. Before the men could snap out of their daze and make way, they heard a loud roar, "Brothers in front, out of the way." The roar carried a sense of authority. Those who heard it could not help but turn their bodies sideways and move their horses' heads. Almost at the same time, the long neigh of a warhorse rang out, it was unimaginably sonorous and sonorous. Then, he saw a red blur flash past him at high speed. With a whoosh, it had already charged out of the front of his steel cavalry formation, crashing into the shadow cavalry formation on the other side. Then there was a sudden crash, and all he could see was the shadow cavalry on the other side falling over. Streams of blood spurted upwards, and their heads rolled all over the ground like a watermelon cart that had been overturned. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of the shadow cavalry had fallen. A straight path of blood and corpses appeared before their eyes. On both sides, there were many shadow cavalry, all of them looking shocked as they stared at their hands in disbelief. Their sabers and spears, no matter what weapons they were no longer in their hands. The only thing they felt was a jolt in their hands. Before they could even see the other party's shadow, their weapons had flown out of their hands. What was left was only their hands that were dripping with blood. 2 days into one. There were some things that had yet to be thought through. Today was only the beginning. Chapter 496. While Yutong's steel cavalry was surprised and overjoyed, they could still see that the crimson trail of blood was still extending in front of them. The red horse was galloping with its head held high while the purple silhouette was unstoppable. Wherever it passed, rows of human heads would fly into the air, spinning in the air. The shadow cavalry that was like an unbreakable line of defense could not be stopped, not even in the blink of an eye, by the man and his steed. The other party was like an extremely sharp long saber while the shadow cavalry was like a soft piece of butter. Wherever the saber passed, there was no resistance. It was as if he could cut from one end to the other with a casual swing of his saber. The commander of the Black Knights, who had also witnessed everything, could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. He felt a chill rising from the bottom of his heart. In an instant, his entire body felt cold. It was as if that person's cold blade had already swept past his neck. Still in shock, he cried out involuntarily, "There's actually such a person in this world. Who is this person?" The group looked at each other, speechless. No one answered. No matter how knowledgeable one was, they could not connect this person who had broken through so forcefully with a certain someone in their memory, not to mention that this was not the impression that the person had given the public. The only thing the shadow cavalry knew was that they had seen a purple silhouette riding on a red steed, sweeping past them. They could only see the gleam of the saber as their comrades fell one after another. They could only see the other party leaving in a cloud of dust as he massacred them. They could not even see his face clearly. "He looks like he's very young." One of the shadow cavalry marshal's hands was empty, blood dripping from his perlicue as the corners of his lips twitched. He felt like he had just been through the gates of hell 4 to 5 times. He, who had always been bold and did not care about life and death, was actually feeling weak all over. He had been lucky to be at the periphery of the fiend's breach just now. He had only managed to pass his saber in time before he was flung away. It was as if he had been struck by lightning, but he had managed to keep his life. If he had gone a little further in just now, his body that had been growing for more than 30 years would have been lying on the ground in tatters. It turned out that even though he said that he didn't care about life and death, when he really faced a life and death situation, he was still afraid. This was how things were in the world. Everyone was afraid of death. The only difference was whether their death was worth it or not. There were grudges and no grudges, and there were regrets. That was all. Very young. The commander of the Black Knights frowned. A very young and powerful Xiaofan? Who is that? Yunyang charged forward like a hot knife through butter, sweeping away all who stood in his way. At this moment, he did not even consider whether his spiritual essence and mystical qi could keep up, nor did he consider anything else. He could only focus on charging forward. There was only one thing on his mind. How is old Marshal Qiu? Did he still have a breath of life left in him? It was at this moment that dozens of beams of sword light attacked from the other end. The sword energy actually sent chills down Yunyang's spine. At the same time, hundreds of people gathered here from all directions. Experts. Yunyang understood immediately. The old marshal had Bai Yixue, a pinnacle expert of this world, protecting and assisting him, but he still could not break out of the encirclement and was in a precarious situation. It was obvious that Dongxian had gathered a large number of experts as well. Even if their top-notch combat power was not up to par, they could still wear you down with sheer numbers. This was a sure-win tactic on the battlefield. Currently, there were about 700 people who had come to stop him. On the other side, Bai Yixue was still surrounded by a dense crowd. At a glance, there were at least thousands of people fighting with all their might. Bai Yixue was breaking out of the encirclement in an unusually frenzied manner. The sword in his hand was like a raging dragon. There were people injured and dismembered by his sword. However, there was always a large number of people who came forward to stop him, delaying Bai Yixue's progress to the maximum. At this moment, there was another person who was moving forward with Bai Yixue. This person was tall and graceful, with a square face and thick eyebrows. Even in the midst of such an intense battle, his every movement and every move was accompanied by a sense of ease and composure, as if he was taking a stroll in the park. It was his cheapskate father, Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, Yun Xiaoyao. As the two of them combined their swords, they formed a shining curtain of light that seemed to be solid. This curtain of light was also the vanguard that charged out from the densely packed enemy troops. Anyone who came into contact with it would either have their limbs torn to shreds, or their entire body would be torn to shreds, and they would die in pieces. Behind both of them were the four great young masters of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. These four young masters were dressed in the uniform of a lowly soldier. Their mouths were askew, their eyes were slanted, their faces drenched in sweat, and they were swinging their sabers and swords madly as they followed the two swordsmen in front of them. Naturally, the ones who were putting in the most effort were their guards, who were already panting and struggling to move. Seeing the purple figure over there, although they couldn't see it clearly from afar, the four fellows were already ecstatic. They shouted in unison, "Boss! Boss help ah. Before their words echoed in the air, they were already stopped by a delicate reprimand. "What are you shouting for? How embarrassing! You're all men asking for help, and you're from spring, summer, autumn, and winter." The four young masters were speechless, their faces filled with grievance. Ever since they were forcefully pulled into the military, they had been struggling with life and death every day. They had had enough of such days. They even had to ask for leave to take a piss or fart. Was this the life of a human? Now that it was a matter of life and death, what's wrong with me shouting for help? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with me wanting to ask? However, looking at Ji Lingxi and Yu Rulan's icy, disdainful gazes, no one dared to ask the question. The main force on the other side was Shengguan Lingxiu, Ji Lingxi, Yu Rulan, and the rest. The three ladies led the experts and valiant generals of the Shengguan family of generals, mustering their remaining strength to fight the enemy as they advanced. At this moment, seeing the purple-robed silhouette coming from afar, the three women's eyes lit up. Shengguan Lingxiu's clear cry rang through the air, "Young Master Yun! The old marshal is here, come quickly!" Yu Rulan and Ji Lingxi did not forget to roll their eyes in the midst of their battle. "Humph, so affectionate." She glared at the purple silhouette who was cutting through the waves and gritted her teeth, thinking, this bastard actually appeared at this time. "I'll deal with you when we get out of here." In the middle of the group were the Shengguan clan's private army and several thousand iron cavalry soldiers. They were in an orderly formation, and this group was led by the iron cavalry's commander, Wang Dinghua. All of these soldiers had grief and indignation on their faces, and their bodies were covered with wounds. Every single one of them was drenched in blood. Other than that, there was no other color. There was only crimson on them, their own blood, the blood of their comrades, and the blood of their enemies. Before Yun Yang arrived, he would never have thought that so many of his acquaintances would be gathered here. No, it should be said that most of his acquaintances from the eastern border were here. Thinking of this, Yun Yang's thoughts grew heavier. In all fairness, the high-end forces on his side were already so strong that it made one's hair stand on end. Excluding himself, there were still Bai Yixue, Fang Mafei, and Yun Xiaoyao, the three Heaven Realm experts, the four noble young masters who had benefited from Yun Yang's spiritual medicine and their guards. Each of them had an extraordinary cultivation base and could be considered the cream of the crop. Although Ji Lingxi and Yu Rolan's cultivation base had yet to reach the Heaven Realm, they were already close to the perfection of the Peak Realm. Even if Shangguan Lingxiu and the Shangguan family's private army had a slightly weaker cultivation base, they were still battle-hardened gods of death, their lethality was not lacking. In addition, there were famed marshals like Qiu Jianhan and Fu Baoguo watching over them. Their combined ability could not be said to be weak, it could even be extremely strong. In spite of this, the current situation was still so dire. One could only imagine how strong the forces on Han Sanhe's side were. It was definitely not something that could be achieved by merely having a superior military force. The martial world experts that could not be seen must be a terrifying number as well. Yun Yang focused his gaze and saw that in the middle of Yutong's breakout troop, everyone was protecting a black carriage with all their might. The small carriage was unusually eye-catching, swaying in the midst of the enemy's camp like a small boat that could capsize at any time in a raging sea, bobbing up and down amidst the endless waves. The Dongxian troops around the carriage were in a frenzy. They were like hungry wolves that had seen fresh meat, charging forward without a care for their own lives. Even when they knew that they would be facing the sharp sabers and swords of several experts, they were fearless in the face of death. Once a batch died, another batch would take its place, and there would only be more of them than before. Even more ferocious. Furthermore, there were countless arrows coming from all directions, and they were pouring down on him without a moment's pause. Wherever the carriage went, the sky would be blanketed by arrows. They were densely packed, endless, and endless. They were just arrows, but they had created the feeling of a surging river that flowed endlessly. One could imagine how ferocious and densely packed the incoming arrows were. Other than that, there were many Dongxian experts who appeared anytime and anywhere under the cover of the troops, causing a considerable amount of damage. Almost every few moments, there would be dozens or even hundreds of experts charging towards the black carriage with their lives on the line. Amidst Dongshuan's formation, the horns were blaring incessantly. It was an order to urge the soldiers to charge forward and kill the enemy. Amidst such a frenzied attack, he still had to issue the order to urge them on. It was evident how determined Han Sanhe was to capture the person in the black carriage and not give up. Who was in the carriage? The question had long been answered, there was no need to answer it. Other than Qiu Jianhan, there was probably no one else in this world who could garner such attention from Han Sanhe. Despite the dire situation, old Marshal Qiu did not come out. He was in the carriage. If he still had the slightest bit of strength left, he would not be so silent. Countless Dongxian soldiers and Dongxian generals were shouting with all their might. Capture Qiu Jianhan alive, 1,000,000 taels of gold, thousands of acres of fertile land, and be made a marquis of 10,000 households. Those who behead Qiu Jianhan will be awarded 1,000,000 taels of gold, and be made a marquis of 10,000 households. Those who have sacrificed themselves in this battle will be compensated tenfold. Their children will be sent to school until they grow up, the military will subsidize them, their third generation will be exempted from taxes, crimes, and military service. Capture Qiu Jianhan alive. Capture Qiu Jianhan alive. There will be a chapter later. I've been writing slowly these 2 days not because I'm stuck in the plot, but because I've been considering life and death. Would it be life or death? I can't make up my mind about this. On the other hand, writing about living and writing about dying both required a large amount of plot development, but they were completely opposite. Chapter 497. Dongshuan's tactic was obvious, it was simple and direct, but it was effective. Qiu Jianhan had to die even if they had to sacrifice their lives. They would not allow Qiu Jianhan, who had fallen to such a state, to have any chance of survival. Great benefits, great reputation, great benefits, and great compensation. As long as they died or were sacrificed in this battle, there would be endless benefits for their descendants to enjoy. Who would not fight to the death? What was more, the enforcement team's gleaming steel sabers were right behind them. Death was inevitable if they went forward, but there was still a chance for them to make a great contribution. Even if they died, there would still be great benefits, it would be worth it no matter how one looked at it. On the other hand, if they hesitated and took half a step back, they would be charged with treason. Not only would they deserve to die, they would also go down in infamy. Yunyang set his target and howled again, "Those who stand in my way shall die." Like a mad tiger, he charged towards the densest group of people. At this moment, the long saber that had already been curled up because of the continuous slashes moved again. It suddenly swung out a stream of blood beads, drawing a semicircle in the crowd. Bang, 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 wherever the saber passed, countless experts of the Jianghu cried out in shock when they came into contact with this enormous power and were sent flying. Among them, there were even more people who were flying in the air when their bodies suddenly split into pieces and they died on the spot. Yunyang and his steed charged forward like a giant ship crossing the surface of the water, forcefully carving out a clear blood-colored dividing line. Wherever he passed, there were corpses strewn all over the ground, there was no sign of life. Along the way, there were millions of soldiers and countless experts, but none of them could stop him, not even for a blink of an eye. Right now, Yunyang was like a bolt of lightning, charging towards Qiu Jianhan's remaining troops who were surrounded by a dense crowd. If Yunyang had been anxious earlier, he had gone berserk now. Not only did he know that old Marshal Qiu, Bai Shue, the four popinjays, Ji Lingxi, Yu Rulan, and Shengguan Lingxiu were there, as well as his nominal father, Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, Yun Xiaoyao. Not only did Yunyang not want to lose old Marshal Qiu, all of these people were his closest friends and family. He could not lose them, he could not lose them. Moreover, the other party's attacks were so crazy that the other side was like a small boat in a raging sea that could capsize at any time. Therefore, Yunyang's combat power was off the charts at this moment. He was like a god of death who had descended into the world, unrivaled. On the other side, Zhang Gu, who was also commanding the battle from a high vantage point, naturally noticed the anomaly on the battlefield at the first instant. It was the terrifying figure that had split his army apart like a bolt of lightning. Zhang Gu was Han Sanhe's disciple, the heir to his legacy. Naturally, he was well versed in the art of war. He could sense that something was amiss at once. He immediately issued an order: mutual perishing tactic. Broken jade tactic. Deal with the purple-clothed man with the same method you used against the white-clothed man. Yutong's Eastern Army had their own price tag. Qiu Jianhan was naturally at the top, followed by Fu Baogua and Bai Shue. Initially, it was because of Bai Shue's past. He was the culprit who had caused Han Sanhe to be pursued and obstructed during his return journey. Now that they had met again, Han Sanhe was more cautious and more intent to kill. However, when they actually met, Dongshuan's ace cultivators had swiftly reported that it was better not to provoke this person if possible. This person's ability had greatly exceeded their knowledge. Normal tactics were meaningless against him, they would only be sending their lives to their graves. Han Sanhe had re-evaluated Bai Shue because of this, even ordering them to relax their attacks on this person. It was fine even if they let him escape unscathed. After all, Bai Yixue was not a high-ranking member of Yutong's military. It would be futile even if he was let go. In spite of this, Bai Yixue had stayed by Qiu Jianhan's side to protect him, never leaving him, like a shadow. It could be said that to kill Qiu Jianhan, one had to kill Bai Yixue first. After a series of twists and turns, the final conclusion was that Bai Yixue had to be killed. No matter how difficult it was to kill him, he had to be killed. In fact, if old Marshal Qiu's remaining troops did not have Bai Yixue's support, they would have collapsed a long time ago. It was also because of this that Bai Yixue had attracted more than half of Dongxuan's ace combat power. Although he had killed countless men, he had also exhausted himself to the point of exhaustion. Right now, he could only maintain the combination of swords with Yun Xiaoyao to maintain the last line of defense. Yun Yang's sudden emergence had replaced Bai Yixue and attracted Zhang Jiyi's attention. Zhang Gu was a famous general in the battlefield, but his knowledge of the differences between cultivation experts was limited. He had overestimated Yun Yang by placing him on the same level as Bai Yixue. In spite of this, Yun Yang's ferocious demeanor of killing gods was much more ferocious than Bai Yixue. At least, in terms of aura, Bai Yixue paled in comparison to this young Master Yun. In spite of this, this was indeed Zhang Jiyi's heartfelt wish. There must not be another white-clothed reaper, nor could he be allowed to meet with Qiu Jianhan's remaining troops. He must be killed before both parties converged. Push the war drums again, put in more effort. End this battle as soon as possible. I want to see Qiu Jianhan's head. Zhang Gu shouted excitedly. He did not notice the strange expression that flitted across Han Sanhe's face, who was resting not far behind him. It was as if he was sighing, as if he was lamenting. Following Zhang Jiyi's command, all the bugles in Dongxuan's army rang loudly at the same time. It was only a moment's difference before all the war drums began to beat loudly as well. It was rapid and relentless, as if they were going to keep blowing and beating like this. At that moment, the entire battlefield was like a massive mythical beast that had been awakened by the series of noises. Its heart pounded violently, causing the blood in its body to burn fiercely. The eyes of Dongxuan's troops were suddenly bloodshot. Perishing together. It's perishing together again. A Dongxian general stood straight on the back of a galloping horse and howled into the sky, his voice shrill and heroic. Perishing together. Are they activating the perishing together again? Countless Dongxian soldiers who had been enlightened seemed to have turned into frenzied beasts, unleashing their ferocity in unison. At this moment, all thoughts of retreat, death, glory, everything was wiped away by the war drums. The deafening bugles were sounding the call of death, or perhaps it was the Grim Reaper's sonata. This was Dongxuan's second perishing together. It was the same tactic that had previously restrained Bai Yixue's forceful breakout and limited him to the current dire situation. Now, it was being used for the second time, and it was targeted at Yun Yang. Yun Yang felt the resistance of his advance increase abruptly, many times more. Countless Dongxian soldiers on the path ahead were pouncing towards him with no regard for their own lives. He was no longer using weapons, techniques, or the orthodox way of fighting on the battlefield to stop him. Instead, he was using his own body and his horse to ram into him, using his own life as an obstacle. That level of madness was truly disregarding life and death. It was no longer sufficient to describe the current method as disregarding life and death. This was because there was no longer any thought of life and death in the minds of those who tried to stop him, they only wanted to stop him. The army on both sides of Yun Yang were gathering towards the center, or perhaps they were squeezed together. Those who were closer to the front would be pushed to Yun Yang by their comrades who were charging towards him, even if they did not charge forward themselves. What kind of charge could continue in this world and faced with such a strong force and interception? In the blink of an eye, Yun Yang's front, back, left, and right were filled with such a frenzied crowd. No matter which direction he looked in, there was an endless sea of people, a sea of human heads. Under such a frenzied and extreme attack, the troops who were escorting Qiu Jianhan were actually stopped in their tracks and were even pushed back thousands of feet. Even when Bai Yixue tried his best to deal with them, he was still forced to retreat. There was a limit to one's strength. Even the pinnacle experts of this world could only sigh helplessly when faced with such a human wave tactic and all-out attack. Yunyang finally understood Bai Yixue's helplessness. His saber was swung again and again, clearing the path ahead, but in the blink of an eye, the path ahead would be filled up again, making it impossible for him to move forward again. Human wave tactic had always been the last resort to deal with superior experts. At the same time, it was also the most effective method. Even if one was amazing and capable, even if one could kill 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 people, he still had 100,000 people, 1,000,000 people. Even if they stood there and let him kill them, he could still exhaust himself until he couldn't even lift his saber in the end. Even if he was tired, he would die of exhaustion. What was more, there were still quite a number of experts among those who had joined the battle. Even if these experts were far weaker than Yunyang and could not afford to face him head-on, their combined strength would still be of some use. Even if Yunyang were to be sliced into pieces, if he were to slice through too many bones during the process, hard bones at that, it would exhaust him even more. Just as Yunyang was about to be engulfed by the swarm of soldiers, the saber in Yunyang's hand left his grip and spun to form a glowing circle of light. It bloomed everywhere, slicing hundreds of people around Yunyang in half at once. The impenetrable space cleared up abruptly. Almost at the same time, Yunyang's right hand reached out and another gleaming saber appeared in his hand. The tossing and grabbing were done without pause, as smooth as flowing water. Seeing that the pressure around it was gone, Reddy charged forward, its hind hooves landing on the heads of two enemy soldiers at the same time. As its feet landed, the brains of the two heads burst. Reddy, who had borrowed the momentum, had already leaped hundreds of feet away. When it landed, it continued its previous move, charging another 100 feet away. When it landed for the third time, it was unable to leap again, falling into another dense encirclement of the enemy soldiers. Dongxuan's army was made up of veterans who were used to fighting. Even when Reddy had succeeded once or twice and escaped once or twice, how could they not make a move? On the other side, Bai Yixue and the rest, seeing Yunyang's rise, mustered their remaining strength and fought to their heart's content, charging over as fast as they could. It was obvious that they wanted to meet up with Yunyang and work together to break out of the encirclement and break the stalemate. Both sides were approaching each other swiftly. It was at this delicate juncture that silhouettes flashed within Dongxuan's formation. Dozens of people dressed in hemp garments and tall crowns appeared abruptly, each of them holding a strangely shaped one-handed hook that gleamed with a cold gleam. The dozens of people moved together, swiftly forming an odd formation. It was only a short exchange, but they had already completely suppressed Bai Yixue and the rest's attack. Chapter 498. Bai Yixue and the rest were exhausted from the prolonged battle and could only unleash half of their peak combat power at most. Even so, it was enough to prove that these hemp-clothed men's combat power was not to be underestimated, it was enough to be called terrifying. Bai Yixue and Marquis Yun were Heaven Realm experts. Even when their combat power was incomplete, they were still far above ordinary 10th perfection peak realm experts. Bai Yixue mustered his remaining strength to fend off the dozens of hemp-clothed men. Right now, Bai Yixue was the only one among Yutong's remnants who could still fight. After all, his 6th heaven-level ability was no joke. The strange formation that the hemp-clothed men had constructed could stop the others, but it was not enough to stop Bai Yixue. As Bai Yixue fought the strange formation, he caught a glimpse of 7 to 8 hemp-clothed men with gold embroidery on their sleeves from the corner of his eyes. These people were obviously of higher status than the group that had appeared earlier. They were watching from the sidelines, waiting for a better opportunity to strike. Bai Yixue almost spat blood at the thought. Ma-clothed gold hook. How dare you interfere in this battle? Are you seeking death? A sneer appeared on the hemp-clothed man's withered face. It's still up to you to decide who is the one seeking death. Bai Yixue cried out angrily, the Ma-clothed sect has never been involved in the war between nations, it has never been involved in the mundane world. What does the war between the two empires have to do with you? Aren't you afraid of going against the rules of your ancestors and incurring the destruction of your sect and the end of your lineage? The Ma-clothed sect was one of the top 10 sects in the Tianxian continent. The only weapon in this sect was the single hook, an unorthodox weapon. Furthermore, the material of the hook was a symbol of the status of the person in the sect. Those who used gold and a special kind of star gold to forge their golden hooks were all important disciples and core members of their sections. In spite of this, the Ma-clothed sect had always stood aloof from worldly affairs. It had never involved itself in the martial world's quarrels, nor had it intervened in the war of empires. It was said that the founder of the sect had once left a message. I have no enmity with the world. I am not tainted by the mundane world, nor have I fallen to the 9 underworlds. Generals, ministers, nobles, what does that have to do with me? My descendants must remember not to provoke gratitude or enmity. Once a grudge is formed, it will never end. Because of that, the Ma sect had never been involved in the affairs of the dynasty. They were only limited to making a name for themselves in the martial world. Whenever the dynasty rose and fell, there was never a trace of the Ma sect disciples. It was to the extent that every new disciple had to swear in front of the ancestor's statue that they would never be involved with the troubles of the dynasty. In spite of this, the Ma sect had appeared publicly to help Dongxian in the battlefield against Yutong. Furthermore, their current target was Yutong's old marshal Qiu Jianhan, an important figure. Bai Yixue could not figure this out no matter what. What was the reason for the Ma sect to suddenly go against their founding master's will and join in this matter? This was too unnatural. No matter what, the reality was that the Ma sect's participation in the war had doubled the resistance to Bai Yixue and the others. With these people as the main attacking force to keep Bai Yixue and the others busy, Dongxuan's deicide archers could choose their positions and execute their attacks with ease. The power of the deicide arrows was not something that Bai Yixue and the others could ignore. A moment of carelessness could severely injure them. With these two restraints, Bai Yixue and the others were truly entangled here, unable to advance any further. Yunyang was still charging forward bravely. Behind him were mountains of corpses and seas of blood, it was a hellish scene. However, the saber in his hand had already been chopped 13 times. He had already seen the men in hempen garments. He also saw the immense pressure Bai Yixue and the others were facing with the participation of the men in hempen garments. The situation had become dangerous once again. Yunyang was enraged. Ma sect. The roar was like a bolt of lightning that shook the sky. At that moment, the men in hempen garments who had been watching the battle had joined in the fight against Bai Yixue and the others. The only one or two who had not joined in the fray turned around instinctively upon hearing the bellow. Amidst the mountains of corpses and seas of blood, a purplish-red silhouette was charging towards them with a murderous aura, like a god of death that had emerged from hell. He was still hollering, "Children and grandchildren, remember this, do not seek vengeance. Once a grudge is formed, it will never end. Men of Ma sect, you must remember what your founding master has said. You must remember what you have done today. Since you have broken your vow, you shall receive your retribution." The billowing anger and murderous intent in his voice caused the pupils of the man in hempen garments to shrink. In a trance, it was as if his founding master was walking towards him amidst the mountains of corpses and seas of blood. The menacing aura was the same. "Who are you?" the man in hempen garments asked in a low voice. Yunyang swung his saber, creating another empty space around him as he said menacingly, "If my sect retreats now, I can promise here that nothing has happened. However, if all of you are still stubborn, I shall kill my way up to Mount Ma-Tu and annihilate your Ma sect, so that all of you can answer to your founding master's vow. What are you going to do? Decide quickly." The man in hempen garments shuddered before he suddenly sneered and said, "You are but a child who is still wet behind the ears. How dare you threaten the Ma sect? We won't retreat, what can you do?" Yun-yang chortled. All right, all right, all right. Just you wait, just you wait." His words reverberated in the air, still deafening and intimidating. The man in hempen garments could not help but shudder when he heard the voice. Then, the purple silhouette stepped out from the crowd, raising his arms continuously as bolts of cold light shot out from his hands like lightning bolts. The cold lights were the weapons he had snatched from the surrounding enemies, tossing them as he snatched them. Then, cries of agony could be heard. The deicide archers who were already in position and ready to go were killed by Yun-yang, one after another. Hundreds of cold lights were hurled continuously, but none of them missed their target. In just a few breaths, hundreds of deicide archers had gone to the underworld. Yun-yang was still in midair when Reddy's mobility increased tremendously after losing the weight on its back. With a long neigh, it stretched its long legs and charged forward again. This time, it leaped 30 feet into the air, stepping on the heads of the enemies as it flew. A horse was actually able to achieve such a shocking leap. Everyone who saw it felt their scalps go numb, as if they were dreaming. After Yun-yang tossed his weapons to kill the deicide archers, he flew into the sky and glided through the rain of arrows before he landed abruptly. He landed right in front of Bai Yixue and Marquis Yun, facing the Ma sect members directly. The steel saber in his hand glowed abruptly. It was Saber Truth, Destiny Blade. Merciless saber, the secular world beyond the saber, life and death in a single thought. With a loud cry, 2 styles and 4 styles were executed simultaneously. As the saber style was unleashed, hundreds of feet of space was filled with the cold gleam of the saber light, leaving no room for maneuver. Then, a series of agonizing cries rang out incessantly. 17 Ma sect members were either turned into a messy pile of mangled corpses on the spot, or their broken bodies were flung away. However, there were no more signs of life in midair, all of them dead. Yun-yang's voice rang out fiercely, "Life lies ahead, charge with me." Then, he took the lead and charged back the way he had come. Yutong's remaining troops perked up when they saw the situation. What a good saying, hope lies ahead. As long as there is a chance, there is hope. What people are most afraid of is losing hope. Stop them. Zhang Ji's voice rang out anxiously from afar. He had never expected that his suicidal tactic would not be able to stop the purple silhouette. Could this person's ability be even greater than that D***ned by Yixue? Yun-yang was enraged when he heard the voice. His gaze turned cold as he extended his arm and a spear was already in his grasp. In the next moment, the spear had already turned into a ray of light that pierced through the sky. Suddenly, it crossed a distance of several thousand feet in an instant, as if ignoring space itself. It suddenly stabbed into the long flag that Zhang Gu was hiding in. With an explosive boom, Zhang Gu let out a loud cry and fell from the sky. Dongshuan's military governor's flag fell as well, the top part of it scattering like it had exploded. Chapter 499. Following the abrupt change in Zhang Ji's flagpole, Dongshuan's war drums and horns stopped abruptly. What followed was a momentary pause in Dongshuan's offensive rhythm. Too many people had seen the shocking scene of Zhang Gu, the temporary marshal, falling from the flagpole. The fate of the marshal who was commanding the battle was unknown. It was a huge blow to any army, and Dongshuan's army was no exception. The morale of the army was thrown into disarray. At that time, Zhang Gu had been commanding the battle from above, so he had not noticed the spear flying through the air. When the spear struck the flag pole, the entire flag pole shook. Only then did Zhang Gu feel as if his entire body had been struck by lightning from the ninth heaven. For a moment, his soul left his body, as if he had been electrocuted. In the next moment, Zhang Gu was pushed away by the reverberating force, plummeting down like a kite with a broken string. Zhang Gu was considered lucky. At least at this moment, his body was still intact. Qi Do, on the other hand, was not so lucky. With a loud bang, it exploded like fireworks. Zhang Gu fell straight down. The incident had come too suddenly that no one could react in time. Finally, Zhang Ji's body landed on the ground with a loud thud. His mouth was the first to touch the ground. With a soft crack, 2 white front teeth flew out. If it were not for the fact that Zhang Gu himself had a certain level of cultivation and had thick skin, he would have been extremely lucky not to have been smashed into a meat patty. Even so, when he struggled to stand up shakily, he still felt as if his head was filled with tofu dregs. For a moment, he was unable to think and was completely unaware of his current situation. It was only after a while that he realized that the drums and horns on his side had stopped. He was so angry that he almost spat blood. Attack! What are you all standing there for? Are all of you dumb? In spite of this, Yun Yang had already killed more than half of the Maai sect's men who had participated in the battle like he was chopping vegetables. The dense golden hook formation had vanished completely. Reddy had arrived as well. Yun Yang mounted his horse and pointed with his saber as he hollered, "Everyone, follow me." Before he finished his sentence, he had already taken the lead and galloped forward. His aura was much stronger than before. The Maai sect was left with more than 20 people. They could still fight, but all of them dared not move, their faces pale. Obviously, they were intimidated by Yun Yang's intimidating aura, intentionally or unintentionally opening up a path for him. This group of people had the same thought in their hearts. This person had said earlier that he would pursue this matter and the Maai sect. Was he serious? Wasn't this too ferocious? Taking advantage of this gap, the large group of men and horses rushed through. In the distance, the 2 sack-clothed men who hadn't made a move since the beginning suddenly floated up. The golden hooks in their hands shone brightly, and they looked like they were about to swoop down from the sky and forcefully intercept him. Yun Yang, who was sprinting, was still aware of the surrounding atmosphere and the danger. When he turned his head abruptly, his gaze fell upon the 2 men like a bolt of lightning. With a long howl, he raised his saber and said eerily, "Maai sect, I hope you won't regret this. Come on." Both men felt a chill run down their spines when they heard him. The aura that had been accumulated to its peak dissipated a little. In spite of it, the arrow was already knocked on the bowstring, it had to be fired. They said coldly, "Very well, very well. This old man would like to see how a young child like you can make the Maai sect regret it. You must escape with your life today before we can talk about the future." Obviously, both of them had a high opinion of Yun Yang, linking his life and death to their revenge in the future. Yun Yang guffawed, his voice rumbling like thunder. Today, with the millions of troops from both countries as witness, the immortal souls of both countries as witness, the moment I, Yun Yang, leave the battlefield, it will be the moment the Maai sect will be annihilated and vanish from this world. The millions of troops from both sides who were fighting each other actually paused in unison. Everyone heard Yun Yang's roar. His vow was earth-shattering and earth-shattering. That voice sounded bright and clear, but it was actually filled with boundless hatred and resentment. As soon as these words were spoken, the originally clear heavens and the earth actually dimmed, and there was even a bolt of lightning that suddenly appeared. It flashed in midair like a silver snake and illuminated the entire battlefield of blood and fire. In the middle of winter, when snow was falling, there was actually a bolt of lightning in the sky. Everyone was shocked to see such a strange sight. This untimely strike of lightning was an indication that heaven had already acknowledged Yun Yang's vow. What he had said when he rose into the air and let the millions of soldiers from both countries bear witness was actually a heaven's vow. Since the heaven's vow had been established, either the Mai sect would be annihilated or Yun Yang would be annihilated. Other than that, there was no third outcome. The two men in Mai were shaken, but they were enraged, their malice soaring to the heavens. This old man shall kill you today, and let heavens will bear witness. Both of them turned into two streams of light and charged over with an intimidating aura. Bai Yixue howled and was about to face the enemy head-on. Bai Yixue was confident that he could easily deal with these two men. You'll lead the group and charge forward later. Leave these two to me. Let's see who will perish under heaven's will. Yun Yang cackled, murderous intent overflowing from him. With a shrill howl, he turned into a bolt of purple lightning and went against the flow. Yun Yang, who soared into the sky from the horse's back, wielding his steel saber, was even more intimidating. At that moment, the heaven and earth fell silent. Saber truth, destiny blade, wielding a saber was equivalent to wielding heaven's will. If heaven wanted you dead, who could live? Amidst the long laughter, the three streams of light collided with each other in midair with abnormal intensity. Saber truth, destiny blades, 3 styles and 6 styles were all executed by Yun Yang in one go, seeking to end the battle quickly. Boom! This collision caused the sky above the battlefield to explode as if a huge bomb had been detonated. All the soldiers and horses within 1,000 feet were blown away like grass in the wind, falling down in all directions along with the wind. Only Yun Yang's holler could be heard in the sky. My sect is nothing more than this. With a flash, Yun Yang landed in front of them. With a long neigh, Reddy leaped up high and reappeared in its majestic form, catching the falling Yun Yang with its horse's back. Then, it turned into a bolt of red lightning and charged forward once more. When Yun Yang landed back on his horse, the two Mai sect members who had fought with Yun Yang just now were still flying in the air, blood gushing out of their orifices. The only thing they could feel now was the weakness in their bodies, unable to stop themselves from being flung away. While they were shocked, they were also bewildered and puzzled. Who was this youth? Young Master Yun of Yutang? How could a young master of a noble family possess such an exquisite saber skill? Although this youth's actual cultivation base was in the heaven realm, he was still much weaker than both of them. However, his saber skill was formidable. He had used the advantage of his exquisite saber skill to counterbalance the disadvantage of lacking cultivation base and had even defeated both of them. At the very last moment, if both of them had not activated the Mai Golden Hook's final ability to self-detonate their weapons to release a strong force to neutralize the shockwave, perhaps both of them would not only be suffering from severe internal injuries, but they would also be dead corpses. Yun Yang, who had gained the upper hand, landed back on his horse. He looked even more ruthless, his purple robe fluttering in the wind. As he galloped, a swishing sound could be heard as he glared and hollered, "Who will fight me?" His voice reverberated, shaking the entire battlefield. His aura was unstoppable as he led the charge. No one dared to stop him wherever he went. The force that had defeated the two Mai sect experts had happened in the sky above the battlefield. Everyone had seen it. In the face of such a super expert, wouldn't it be equivalent to courting death if he really stood in front of him? With the precedent set by Bai Yixue, the undefeatable experts could be indulged for a while. Everyone had their reservations and there was no order from their higher-ups, so naturally, no one dared to stop him. Bai Yixue and Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, Yun Xiaoyao, were behind Yun Yang, one on his left and one on his right. They were like two peerless killing gods, unstoppable like mad tigers unleashed from the cage. The three of them joined forces, creating a huge gap in Dongxuan's army in just a moment. Nearly 100 Dongxian experts tried their best to stop them again, but they were killed the moment they met. By the time they reunited with the others, Yutong's army had already left. It was at this moment that Fu Baoguo's steel cavalry of the serving army arrived as well. After going through many obstacles, the two armies finally met in the enemy's formation. Charge! Break through Dongxuan's army! Yunyang hollered, warning them that it was not the time to let down their guard. On the contrary, their combat power was now trapped in the enemy's heavy encirclement. The resistance would not be much easier than before, so they could not afford to let down their guard for even a moment. As if in response to Yunyang's warning, Yutong's horn and war drum resounded deafeningly. The other half of the steel cavalry that Fu Baoguo had left behind, more than 100,000 men, charged forward. The elders of my hometown are on my shoulders. The nation's safety lies in my battle. Fu Baoguo's voice was hoarse, but it was soul-stirring. Fight! Tianxian Cliff is behind us, the 9 Supreme's lords are watching us. They're watching us. With a loud boom, all of Yutong's soldiers felt a surge of blood rush from their hearts. For a moment, they felt like they were about to explode. Charge forward and fight Dongxian to the death. Chapter 500. Fu Baoguo was a veteran in the battlefield. Although he hoped to save the old marshal, he did not use all of his troops for the rescue. Instead, he left half of the steel cavalry behind. After all, his current responsibility was to build another fortress of resilience to block Dongxuan's invasion as much as possible. However, the current situation had changed. With Yunyang's forceful entry into the battle, his side's morale had skyrocketed, especially when the serving army and half of the steel cavalry had already joined the old marshal's remaining troops. They had to fight with everything they had now, otherwise, not only would the old marshal's remaining troops not be rescued, the serving army and half of the steel cavalry would also be buried with them. By then, the loss would outweigh the gain and the combat power that was used to build the new defense line would be greatly damaged. How could they resist Dongxuan's army for long? Judging from the current situation, Yutong's morale had skyrocketed. Not only could the old marshal's remaining troops be rescued, the first half of the steel cavalry, the serving army, would not suffer too much damage. In addition, the current situation was advantageous to Yutong. They could seize the opportunity to counterattack Dongxian and dampen their morale, which would greatly benefit the continuation of the war. In light of this, Fu Baoguo had decided to launch an all-out attack. Yunyang finally heaved a sigh of relief when he saw Fu Baoguo's actions. He discreetly retrieved a few bottles of medicinal pills from his ring, giving 3 pills to each of them and sending them to Bai Yixue and the rest. The group had already reached the stage of exhaustion, but they were barely holding on with their last breath. Seeing that the pills were right in front of them, they swallowed them all at once. It was obviously not the time for small talk. After catching their breaths, they mustered their remaining energy and charged out, killing their way in a frenzy. Dongxuan's army did not have a commander to issue orders at the moment, so there was no way to respond. It was a mess of chaos. When Zhang Gu returned to another flagpole, intending to continue issuing orders and regroup, he saw that Yutong's army had already gathered into a raging dragon and was charging forward. Yutong had successfully broken out of the encirclement and left in a cloud of dust. Seeing that the outcome had been decided, Zhang Gu came down dejectedly and sprinted all the way to Han Sanhe, grumbling, "Teacher, why did you?" Just as he said a few words, he felt that his tone was too heavy and disrespectful. This was definitely not the attitude one should have when speaking to a teacher, so he subconsciously shut his mouth. Han Sanhe chuckled. "You want to ask me why I didn't take command just now?" Zhang Gu nodded. Han Sanhe had not interfered in the battle to kill Qiu Jianhan just now, he had handled the entire situation himself. In fact, ever since they charged out of the western gate of the Fortress of Resilience, Han Sanhe had given up on commanding the army and passed all authority to Zhang Gu. Qiu Jianhan is a few years older than me. Looking at the fluttering flags in the air, Han Sanhe sighed in disappointment and said, in terms of military career, he's my senior and a bosom friend who has fought with me for a lifetime. Previously, I had no choice but to listen to your plan and injure Qiu Jianhan with a sneak attack. I was already feeling helpless then. Now, I really can't bear to see my lifelong enemy, my lifelong rival, die so tragically on the battlefield. Especially when he dies without a corpse or head separated from his body. Han Sanhe's voice was laced with too many emotions. Zhang Gu was stunned when he heard the words. Suddenly, he seemed to understand Han Sanhe's thoughts and felt a jolt in his heart. Dying on the battlefield was the fate of every soldier. It was also a soldier's highest honor. But, it definitely didn't include being beheaded when he didn't even have the strength to retaliate. To a warrior, it was the greatest humiliation, a humiliation that could never be washed away. The most fitting ending for a hero was to die in a fierce battle on the battlefield. However, after being ambushed, he should never lie on the ground with his last breath, only to have his head chopped off by someone else as a reward for his military exploits. The Qiu Jianhan of today might be the Han Sanhe of tomorrow, or even Zhang Gu himself in the future. His teacher must have seen himself in Qiu Jianhan, right? Zhang Gu, who was in Qiu Jianhan's shoes, was deep in thought. Since ancient times, famed generals are like beauties. Han Sanhe sighed, a little melancholy. Qiu Jianhan's hair and beard are all white. Ah, the pause in the middle of the sentence made Zhang Ji's heart feel like it had been struck by a heavy hammer. Indeed, be it the god of war or the legendary marshal, they would have to fall from the long river of history. The glorious time that belonged to them would only last a few decades at most. Qiu Jianhan, like his teacher, was already an extremely fortunate existence. Yutong has already lost this battle. There's no turning back. Han Sanhe said dejectedly, I believe that even if Qiu Jianhan can keep his life for now, he won't be able to live for more than a few days. Zhang Gu, why must you behead a hero of a generation? No matter how despicable he was against the enemy and how much of a headache he gave you, it's undeniable that he was an opponent worthy of respect. He was a hero worthy of anyone, especially a militant. Zhang Gu felt ashamed as he bowed in agreement, no longer dwelling on the matter. On the other side. Amidst the chaos, Yun Yang and the rest had finally escorted Qiu Jianhan's carriage to Fu Baoguo's camp. Fu Baoguo sprinted over at once, asking anxiously, how is old Marshal? Is he all right? Yun Yang sighed. His mood was equally heavy, no less than Fu Baoguo's, perhaps even more so. In fact, he had wanted to ask the same question as well. He had wanted to do so when he had charged over just now. However, he dared not ask. He was afraid, truly afraid. He was afraid that what he would hear would be news that he could not accept. I've lost too much. I don't want to lose anymore, I can't lose anymore, I can't lose anymore. Oh my God. The question that had been lingering in Yun Yang's heart for a long time was asked by Fu Baoguo. He clenched his fists tightly, his ears perked up as he listened nervously, listening for the inevitable answer. Old Marshal is heavily injured now. He was ambushed by the phantom archer Jin Wudong during the battle at the West Gate and was shot. Bai Yixue looked ashamed. After all, Qiu Jianhan had been ambushed under his protection, but he had been ambushed. No matter what, it was a humiliation that could not be washed away. I've killed Jin Wudong in the midst of the chaos as well, Bai Yixue uttered weakly, but was met with a sharp glare from Yun Yang. The demonic archer Jin Wudong had always had the title of unrivaled archer in the world. Weapons like arrows had always been used exclusively by the military. There were rarely people in the martial world who would use bows and arrows as their weapons. Even if they did, it was just something that came along with it, there were hardly any who were adept at using it. However, this demonic archer Jin Wudong was different. Because his main weapon, and also his only weapon, was the bow and arrow. This was also his only means of attack. His skills were all tied to the bow and arrow in his hands. It was said that this person's archery skill had been cultivated to the acme of perfection. The strongest bow in the military was no more than 6 stones, even the deicide bow, which required a cultivator with a high mystical chi cultivation base to use, was only a 10-stone bow. Such a strong bow was almost at the limit of what a human body could bear. It was also the limit that a human could continuously wield. However, this demonic archer's bow was made of stellar wood as the backbone and the flood dragon's tendon as the string. Someone had tested it and found that at least 30 stones of strength was needed to draw this bow to its fullest potential. When the arrow was shot from this bow, it was so fast that it was invisible. Even a mystical cultivator in perfection of the peak realm might not be able to catch it with their naked eyes. It was said that he had to pause for a moment after his arrow had hit its target before the whistling sound of the arrow flying in the air could be heard. The speed of the arrow was even faster than the speed of sound. Other than being an archer, Jin Wudong was also an assassin. This time, even Bai Yixue did not expect that Dong Xian would actually invite this demonic archer to specifically target Qiu Jianhan in order to crush Yutong's army as soon as possible and to succeed. Even when Bai Yixue had displayed his prowess and killed the demonic archer, the old general had still been gravely injured by this man. How did things turn out like this? Yun Yang was relieved when he heard that he had only been ambushed. "I'll go check on old Marshal. Bai Yi, come in and tell me what's going on." To Yun Yang, who possessed the endless divine art, there were few internal and external injuries that he could not handle. Even when Emmy was no longer around and the air of vitality was no longer there, Yun Yang was still confident that he could save the old marshal. After the city had been set ablaze, Qiu Jianhan had led the remaining troops out of the city and built a high ground at the west gate. He had even set up a formation 500 feet away from the west gate. It was a chokehold formation, the second natural stronghold of the Fortress of Resilience. If Dong Xian wanted to enter Yutong's hinterland, they had to pass through the Fortress of Resilience. The Fortress of Resilience only had 2 gates, and it had been so since the beginning of its construction, the East Gate and the West Gate. You may have breached the East Gate, but as long as I guard the West Gate, you will still not be able to do as you please. There is no way forward. The truth was just as old Marshal Qiu had predicted. Although Dongxuan's troops were stationed at the Fortress of Resilience, they had been ambushed by Qiu Jianhan when they charged out from the West Gate, intending to invade Yutong. Under Qiu Jianhan's forceful command, the entire West Gate had become a barren land. Dongxuan's troops had wanted to ride on the momentum of their victory and had been focused on advancing forcefully. Who would have thought that the situation outside had already changed? A considerable number of Dongxian soldiers who had initially come out had died. The ring-shaped formation that Qiu Jianhan had led his men to set up could be described as a deadly formation. Its lethality was astonishing. Anyone who came out from the West Gate, no matter which direction they came from, could not avoid being bombarded by arrows. After all, the West Gate was only so big, and the number of people who came out at once was limited. They could not form a formidable combat force within a short period of time, so they could only allow themselves to be slaughtered. However, this situation only lasted for a day before Dongxuan's extremely passive situation was broken. Han Sanhe had ordered the West Gate of the Fortress of Resilience to be torn down. Even the wall had been toppled. With the western wall gone, Dongxuan's troops charged out like a tidal wave. The deadly formation that Qiu Jianhan had set up was no longer targeted, so it was difficult for it to be effective. However, old Marshal Qiu would rather die than retreat, sacrificing himself to buy time for Fu Baogua to build another line of defense for the Fortress of Resilience. Under the old marshal's relentless command, the battle lasted for 3 days and Dongxuan's army was actually contained. In spite of this, the old marshal's 50,000 men were left with less than 10,000 men after 3 days. It was difficult for him to do anything else. In spite of this, Qiu Jianhan seemed to have made up his mind. Since the fortress of resilience was gone, he did not plan to go back alive. He had been fighting on the front line all this while. No matter how Shangguan Lingxiu, Bai Shue, Marquis Yun, and the rest tried to persuade him, Qiu Jianhan refused to leave. He was old and ruthless. Once he had made up his mind, not even a deity could change his mind. Seeing that old Marshal Qiu was about to be buried here with his subordinates, a turning point had arrived. It was at this moment that Dongxian sent out assassins that targeted the old marshal. The most famous of them was the phantom archer, Jin Wudong. When the army was engaged in a new round of battle, Jin Wudong, who was dressed in a soldier's uniform and hiding among the troops, had approached Qiu Jianhan. The lethal arrow came swiftly. Bai Shue had finally sensed the danger and swung his sword to intervene at the critical moment, but he was still a little too late. He had only managed to deflect the arrow by a tiny bit. It was fortunate that there was such a slight deviation. Otherwise, the arrow would have pierced through Qiu Jianhan's heart directly. Ultimately, the arrow had left a hole in Qiu Jianhan's body, piercing through his chest and back. Qiu Jianhan was severely injured and on the brink of death. In his grief, Bai Shue charged into Dongxuan's formation, sword in hand, and pursued the ghoul archer, Jin Wudong, amidst the tens of thousands of soldiers. Until the ghoul archer was chopped into minced meat, he had even wanted to kill Dongxuan's main general with an eye for an eye. It was also because of this that Dongxuan's mutual destruction tactic was triggered. Bai Shue retreated in the end, resentful. Bai Shue's killing spree had allowed Yutong to survive the battle that day, but Yutong had lost Qiu Jianhan's command. Without Qiu Jianhan, Yutong's defeat was already set in stone. Even when Shangguan Lingxiu raised the flag of the family of generals and tried her best to reorganize the remaining troops, there was only a slight improvement. They could not deal with the Dongxian troops that were surging out of Han Sanhe like a tidal wave. Marquis Yun was decisive, ordering the entire army to break out of the encirclement and retreat under the cover of the night. Since it was impossible, it was better to preserve as much combat power as possible and return to Fu Baoguo's side to fight Dongxian and Sheikh Han Sanhe together. Dongxuan's army would not let them go easily, of course. They gave chase from the back and swiftly surrounded Qiu Jianhan's remaining troops. At the critical moment, the 2 squads of steel cavalry that had been lurking in the surrounding forest could no longer hold themselves back. They would rather disobey Fu Baoguo's military order and charge out to provide support. Both sides merged and retreated as they fought, finally persevering until Yun Yang came to help. Then, they met up with Fu Baoguo's army that was stationed under Tianxian Cliff. Because of this, Yutong and Dongxuan's war had begun anew. Yun Yang entered the tent quickly and saw Qiu Jianhan lying straight on a simple military bed. His body was stained with blood and there were a few wounds on his face as well. His flesh and blood were curled up, making him look menacing. Yun Yang did not even feel the old marshal's breathing. If it were not for the slow, weak rise and fall of his chest, Yun Yang would have suspected that the old marshal was already dead. Under the dim yellow light, the old marshal's white beard was stained with blood as he lay there quietly. Yun Yang's eyes burned, almost tearing up. This old marshal who had given his entire life for Yutong looked so desolate and helpless right now. Chapter 501. Yun Yang walked over quickly and grabbed Qiu Jianhan's hand. Without a word, he cultivated the endless divine art and slowly transferred the overflowing vitality into old Marshal Qiu's body. Only then did he begin to inspect Qiu Jianhan's current injuries in detail. Yun Yang could not help sucking in a breath of cold air even though he was a veteran of the battlefield. The old marshal had taken the lead, not avoiding danger. There were indeed many wounds on his body, but more than 90% of them were flesh wounds. Other than having Bai Yishue's protection, the old marshal's cultivation base was extraordinary as well, so it was not a big deal that he had not sustained any other serious injuries. There was only one fatal injury that had caused him to fall into such a state, but this one serious injury was enough to kill him. The arrow had been shot at the vital point of his left chest, piercing through his front and back. If one were to look at it from the surface, the wound could be said to have gone straight through his heart. How could a careless man be so fortunate? Fortunately, Yunyang knew that Bai Yishue had managed to block the sudden fatal arrow at the last moment when it was about to hit its target. It was fortunate that the slight delay had caused the arrow to deviate a little when it pierced Qiu Jianhan's chest. Just a little, just a little. Otherwise, Qiu Jianhan would have died on the spot. Even so, Qiu Jianhan was still hovering on the edge of life and death. Perhaps, it could be said that half of his foot was already in the jaws of death, and it would be difficult for him to turn back. Even when Yunyang saw it now, he was not confident. Yunyang tried his best to save Qiu Jianhan, but after an hour of cultivating the endless divine art, Qiu Jianhan's injuries did not seem to improve at all. The endless divine art that Yunyang had high hopes for and had always been successful seemed to have lost its effect today. Even the rate of his pulse did not increase, not even by a little. Qiu Jianhan was still lying in silence like before, but Yunyang could clearly feel that the old marshal's remaining vitality was slipping away bit by bit. It was as if life no longer belonged to this old and severely injured body. Of course, Yunyang was unwilling to give up just like that. Other than continuing to cultivate the endless divine art, he had also used all the superior spiritual medicine and superior medicine he had. However, this could only slightly slow down the loss of Qiu Jianhan's vitality, it could not actually stop it. At this moment, Yunyang was filled with extreme hatred. He hated himself for losing the Nine Supremes' power at such a crucial moment. He hated himself even more for not being able to open his own divine sense space even though his cultivation had already recovered. If he could open up the space and restore his connection with Emi, Qiu Jianhan could be saved with Emi's air of vitality. With Emi's help, even if the old marshal had breathed his last breath, Yunyang was confident that he could save him as long as it did not take long. In spite of this, Yunyang could only watch as his most respected elder slowly passed away in front of him. He could do nothing but sigh helplessly. The frustration of being powerless but unable to do anything almost drove Yunyang mad. Behind him, everyone watched Yunyang's rescue in silence. Everyone held their breaths, afraid that the slightest movement would disturb Yunyang. Everyone's eyes were gleaming with hope. They hoped that Yunyang could create another legend and save the old marshal. Fu Baogua, Marquis Yun, Wang Dinghua, Shangguan Lingxiu, Bai Yishue, the four noble young masters, everyone here shared the same thought, but in the end, they could only see Yunyang's back, which had always been as straight as a sword, slowly slumping, as if he had lost all his strength and could no longer continue. How is the old marshal? Is he getting better? Fu Baogua's voice was filled with anxiety. When he asked this question that was meant to test Yunyang's luck, his heart sank instead. He had already seen the glaring wound on Qiu Jianhan's body. This kind of injury was a fatal injury, a serious injury that could not be cured. No matter how profound his cultivation base was, he would still die from such a grievous injury. There was no chance of a fluke. The reason why the old marshal was still alive was because he still had a breath left in him. If this breath was gone, he could die at any moment. The dim and radiant path was different. Marquis Yun, Bai Yishue, and the others looked extremely grim. Shangguan Lingxiu's eyes were already glistening with tears. Her eyes were glued to Yunyang's face. Among everyone present, other than Fang Mafei, only Shangguan Lingxiu knew Yunyang's real identity. Initially, Shangguan Lingxiu had pinned all her hopes on him. To her, there should be nothing in this world that the Nine Supremes Lords could not do. Take today's battle for example. Their side had fallen into a hopeless situation, but Yun Yang's arrival had turned the tables, opening a path of survival in the midst of death. The counterattack from breaking the siege was immediate. In spite of this, everyone could see Yun Yang's dilemma. Shangguan Lingxiu still hoped that Yun Yang could say that there was hope for the old marshal to survive. If even Yun Yang could not do anything about it, then there would be no turning back. Yun Yang knelt in silence, his face pale and his gaze dull. Suddenly, he spat out a mouthful of blood. Yun Yang's injury had not fully healed. His hasty journey had already violated the taboo of an injured person. Then, he had charged into the battlefield and engaged in a fierce battle, especially the intense fight with the Ma'i sect's 2 experts, which had worsened his condition to the point where he could no longer bear the burden. In spite of this, Yun Yang's only hope was that nothing would happen to the old marshal and that the fortress of resilience would not fall. Now, the latter had become a reality. Although the former still had a breath left, it was only a breath. It could even be gone at any moment. Both of these hopes were about to become a bubble. How could Yun Yang not be mentally and physically exhausted? He had tried hard just now, wanting to open up a space to connect to Emmy and fight for the old marshal's life. However, the space still seemed to have disappeared completely and Emmy did not respond. In the past, the strange energy that flowed around his body like his arms and fingers could not be used at all. The power of vitality. The power of meteorite. The power of the nation's fate. The endless divine art's power to eradicate evil and promote kindness. As long as any one of these forces could be mobilized, Yun Yang was confident that he could stabilize Qiu Jianhan's injuries. At the very least, he would not die immediately. However, all these forces were sealed in his deific consciousness space. He could not contact or mobilize them at all. Yun Yang's heart sank as if he had fallen into a bottomless abyss. Could it be that he had to face the painful experience of losing a close friend again? Thinking of this, his vision darkened. His emotions were unusually agitated, causing his old and new injuries to flare up at the same time. He could not help but spit out a mouthful of blood and almost fainted. "There's no other way, I can't do anything." Yun Yang's weak voice was like a hammer that hammered into everyone's hearts. Everyone felt their hearts wrench in pain. Shangguan Lingxiu's tears streamed down her cheeks. Even the 9 Supreme's lords were helpless. Was the old marshal hopeless? Fu Baoguo lowered his head abruptly, the muscles on his face spasming as he fell to his knees. His forehead was pressed against the ground as tears streamed down his cheeks soundlessly. As Fu Baoguo fell to his knees, the tent was plunged into a sorrowful atmosphere. Cough, a faint cough sounded abruptly. Everyone turned towards the source of the sound through their teary eyes. Qiu Jianhan, who was lying on the bed, suddenly coughed, his chest rising and falling violently. Then, his eyes that had been shut for a long time opened. However, the old marshal's breathing grew more and more rapid, like a pair of bellows blowing against his chest. At this critical juncture, Qiu Jianhan had miraculously woken up. The old marshal opened his eyes slowly, his gaze still a little dazed as if he was thinking about something. However, when he saw the few faces above him, his gaze shone faintly. His lips moved slightly as if he wanted to say something. Shangguan Lingxiu pressed her ear closer quickly but could only hear Qiu Jianhan's voice as soft as a mosquito's hum, barely audible. It was as if he had used up all his remaining strength to finally say, Yun Yang is here. Shangguan Lingxiu nodded, her eyes teary. He's here, he just arrived, he saved us from the siege." The old marshal's eyes shone brightly as if he was suddenly invigorated. His voice grew slightly louder as well, "Everyone, get out. Yun Yang stays." The old man's pale face miraculously flushed with a few traces of red. In spite of this, everyone present understood that this was the final radiance of a dying man. The old marshal did not have long to live. Chapter 502. Shangguan Lingxiu nodded, choking with sobs. She stood up immediately and said in a low voice, "Old Marshal has asked all of us to leave, only Yun Yang is allowed to stay. All of you, leave, quickly." She knew that time was of the essence. The old marshal might not be able to last much longer. She pushed and shoved everyone out without a word, chasing them far away, isolating the tent from the rest of the crowd beyond 500 feet. The old marshal was at the final stage of his life. The contents of his conversation with Supreme Cloud, whose identity had been kept a secret before his death, must be of great importance. No one should listen, no matter who it was. If it were possible, Shangguan Lingxiu wanted to chase everyone off the mountain to ensure her safety. The 500 feet of space was still filled with the beating of war drums and the faint sounds of killing from the battlefield. The voices inside were so soft that even if the gods wanted to hear it, they would not be able to do so, would they? Shangguan Lingxiu thought so, but the sorrow in her heart only deepened as tears streamed down her cheeks. For a moment, she felt weak and hopeless. Old Marshal Qiu Jianhan was the empire of Yutang's pillar of support. Now, this pillar of support was about to fall. What would happen to Yutang in the future, given the current war? Would its future be bleak? Yun Yang resisted the searing pain in his chest and went over with great effort, saying, "Old Marshal, I'm here, I'm here." Qiu Jianhan's gaze was starting to lose focus, but he stared at Yun Yang's face in a daze, studying it carefully and seriously, trying his best to focus his gaze to see clearly. Finally, a forlorn smile appeared at the corners of his lips as he said in a low voice, "All of them have left, all of them have left," Yun Yang replied. Qiu Jianhan was still worried and said, "You, go, take a look, ask them to go further." Yun Yang's heart skipped a beat as he came to the entrance of the tent in a stride. Looking outside, he saw that everyone was already hundreds of feet away from the tent. They would not be able to hear anything from here. After making sure, Yun Yang returned to the bed. "Old Marshal, they're all very far away, Qiu Jianhan's gaze sharpened abruptly. He was still panting for a moment before he lowered his voice and said softly, "This old man can't make it this time, but before I leave, I still have an unfulfilled wish." Yun Yang said hurriedly, "Old Marshal, please speak." Yun Yang will go through fire and water to fulfill Old Marshal's last wish. Qiu Jianhan mumbled softly, "There's no need. This old man only has one question in his mind. I want to know the answer. If I don't, I will not die in peace." Yun Yang replied, "Please ask away, Old Marshal. I will tell you everything I know." Qiu Jianhan coughed again, barely able to catch his breath. Yun Yang's endless divine art had been circulating in his body, helping him to hold on to his last breath, but he looked even more lethargic than before. Yun Yang's endless divine art had been circulating in his body, helping him to hold his breath, but he looked even more lethargic than before. His eyes shone as he looked into Yun Yang's eyes, panting as he asked, "Yun Yang, are you, was he Supreme Cloud?" This was Yun Yang's biggest secret. Yun Yang had never revealed his secret to anyone. Now, looking into the old marshal's eyes, Yun Yang did not hesitate as he leaned close to the old marshal's ear and whispered, "Old Marshal, you're right. I'm Supreme Cloud, the only one left among the 9 Supremes." Qiu Jianhan's face was flushed, his eyes glowing even brighter. He stared at Yun Yang joyfully, liking him more the more he looked at him. He said in relief, "The 9 Supremes are not extinct after all. This old man can finally rest assured. Heaven, still, protects Yutang." One of his hands groped about and finally found Yun Yang's hand. With an unknown strength, he gripped it tightly and stared at Yun Yang without blinking. This old man didn't guess wrongly, but this secret, you must keep it forever. Don't let anyone know, don't, yes. Yun Yang's tears streamed down his cheeks, feeling like his heart had shattered into 8 pieces. The pain was so excruciating that he could barely breathe. Once again, he had to face the death of a loving elder. Could it be that this was his fate? Keep this secret. Yutang can survive, if not, I know. I will never let anyone know my identity. Yun Yang promised firmly. Xiao Jinhan's breathing weakened bit by bit, but a satisfied smile still hung on his face. His hand was still gripping Yun Yang's hand tightly, his gaze still filled with love as he stared at Yun Yang and said softly, good child, good child. Yun Yang could not hold it in any longer, suddenly bawling his eyes out. At this moment, this mighty Lord Supreme Cloud was crying like a child. Old Marshal, don't die. I've lost too much. You can't die anymore. I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore. Yun Yang was sobbing, his face devoid of any semblance of dignity. Xiao Jinhan's warm and loving gaze fell on his face as he said softly, silly child. How can a person not die? His gaze grew distant as he murmured, speaking of which, this life of mine is actually enough. It's just that, my death, the country's safety, the old wife at home. His gaze was filled with unconcealable longing as he murmured, can't give up. Can't give up. But, the motherland is in chaos, how can we cherish this body of ours? Listening to the old marshal's murmur, Yun Yang, who had lost his soul, burst into tears as he was overwhelmed with grief. Suddenly, the sound of galloping horses came from outside the tent. A voice bellowed anxiously, Marshal, urgent military news. Fu Baoguo's furious voice rang out from afar, stop. What are you shouting for? I'm not dead yet, get down here. Obviously, Fu Baoguo was afraid that the sudden voice would interrupt the old marshal's last words. However, the galloping reminded Yun Yang of something. The mournful cries that had never stopped abruptly. He lifted his head abruptly, mumbling to himself. Horse, military news. Ready? Ready. The old marshal's consciousness was blurred once more as he answered subconsciously, what? Yun Yang was stunned for a moment before he jumped up in ecstasy. Old Marshal, you're saved. You're definitely saved. I've thought of a way. How could I be so stupid? The life-saving spiritual medicine is with me but I can't remember it. Tears of ecstasy streamed down his cheeks. However, Xiao Jinhan's consciousness grew increasingly blurry as he murmured, Your Majesty. Old Xiao has passed away. At this moment, the old marshal had actually fallen into a coma. It was obvious that he had reached his limit. Perhaps his soul would be sent to the underworld at the very next moment. Yun Yang dared not hesitate as he sprung up and stretched out his hand. A gleaming dagger appeared in his grasp as he tore off his robe sleeves and placed his wrist before Xiao Jinhan's mouth. With a slash of the dagger, fresh blood gushed from his wrist. Yun Yang's free hand pried the old marshal's mouth open at once and dripped his blood drop by drop into it. His own blood had miraculous effects, and this was already evident already. However, the old marshal was on the brink of death and might not be able to withstand such a huge amount of medicinal power. He could only rely on dripping his blood bit by bit, gradually, in order to bring him back to life and turn the situation around. The self-healing ability of ace cultivators was extremely strong. Yun Yang had only bled for a moment before his wound started to clot. Yun Yang waved his dagger again and cut himself, causing the wound to open up again. He repeated this process until he had dripped 3 big bowls of blood before he finally stopped. So much fresh blood should be enough for the old marshal to turn the situation around, right? Yunyang could not help but let out the breath that he had been holding in. He was shocked to realize that his head was spinning and his organs felt like they were about to explode. Unable to hold on any longer, he stumbled and fell to the ground with a thud. The next moment, he felt endless fatigue and endless darkness surging over him before he lost consciousness. Chapter 503. When Marquis Yun and the rest had waited for too long and finally rushed back to the tent to check on the situation, they were shocked to see that both men in the tent were covered in blood. One was still lying on the bed without a sound, while the other was lying on the ground without a sound. Everyone couldn't help but jump in fright, but then they discovered to their pleasant surprise, Yunyang isn't dead. Shengguan Lingxiu exclaimed in delight, he's still alive. He's just fainted. It seems like he's exhausted from excessive blood loss. The old marshal was important, but in Shengguan Lingxiu's eyes, the 9 Supremes Lords were still more important, especially when the 9th Supremes Lord was Yunyang, her something. Therefore, compared to everyone else who was concerned about the old marshal, her first target of observation was Yunyang. The old marshal isn't dead either. Fu Baoguo's eyes were wide, his heart filled with bliss for a moment. He almost wanted to scream and jump. He's still breathing, it's much stronger now. His pulse is stable as well. This is a great sign, it's unbelievable. Everyone was indescribably ecstatic when they heard the news. Marquis Yun and Bai Yixue were still in slight disbelief as they went over to examine him closely. Although Qiu Jianhan was still unconscious and in poor condition, there was a hint of redness in his cheeks. Even though the wound on his chest was still horrifying and ghastly, his pulse had indeed calmed down, a stark contrast from the terrible condition that had only occurred once a long time ago. Both of them were experts in cultivation and came to the same conclusion in an instant. At least for now, although the old marshal was still unconscious, his life was no longer in danger. Although they did not know what kind of sequela such a serious injury would leave behind, whether he could wake up or not, for now, the old marshal who was supposed to die, had survived. The old marshal's life was saved. One of Yutang's 3 pillars had not collapsed. Thank God. Shengguan Lingxiu was so overjoyed that tears were rolling down her cheeks. Although she was more concerned about Yunyang, the old marshal was a respected senior to her, an irreplaceable pinnacle of Yutang's military. It was a great blessing that he was saved from certain death. Fu Baoguo grabbed Marquis Yun's hand and shook it as if he had gone mad. He was so grateful that he did not know what to say. Marquis Yun, sir, thank you, for raising such a good son. Qiu Jianhan was gravely injured and his life was hanging by a thread, his condition was deteriorating by the day. During this period of time, no one else had come in, only Yunyang had been in the room previously. Qiu Jianhan's condition had taken a turn for the better, it must be Yunyang's doing. There was no dispute about this, and no one would doubt it. Besides, the fact that Yunyang was so tired showed how much effort he had put in. Fu Baoguo no longer had any doubts about old Marshal Qiu's evaluation of Yunyang now. This child was indeed extraordinarily capable, the role he could play was even greater than his father's. There was no doubt that the father was stronger than the son. Marquis Yun looked at Yunyang who had fainted and said softly, Marshal Fu is being too polite. This is Yunyang's duty. It's my duty to save old Marshal. There's no need to thank me, it's not worth mentioning. Fu Baoguo was flushed, his spirits high as he guffawed. How is it not worth mentioning? Whoever saves the old marshal is my, Fu Baoguo's, savior, second parent. Ha ha ha. Everyone chuckled at his words. After all, if Yunyang was Fu Baoguo's second parent, then what about Marquis Yun who was standing in front of them now? Young Master Yun looks like his injuries aren't light either. The rescue process must have taken too much effort. Shengguan Lingxiu said rather anxiously, I think it's better to take him to rest first. Even if he's fine, he'll need a few days to recuperate. Marquis Yun smiled gently. If that's the case, I'll have to trouble Lady Shangguan. Everyone smiled meaningfully when they heard him. Shangguan Lingxiu blushed immediately, but she did not shy away. She picked Yunyang up carefully and ran out as if she was running for her life. Ha ha ha. Fu Baogua guffawed. Marquis Yun, it looks like good things are about to happen to your family. Since he had already hugged Yunyang, how could he avoid the skin-to-skin contact? A certain someone's reputation was tied to the lady, of course, he had to get close to her. Marquis Yun smiled calmly and said, "This child is really lucky. It is his duty to try his best to save the old marshal, but he has gained this opportunity. What a blessing. Let's hope that this will work out. By the way, should this matter be considered as the old marshal being the matchmaker?" Everyone chortled when they heard him, praising Marquis Yun for his eloquence. He had even brought the old marshal's blessings with his words. If the old marshal wasn't doing well, how could he be the matchmaker? He was indeed a perceptive person. When they turned back to look at the unconscious Qiu Jianhan, everyone felt a sense of relief. It was great that old Marshal Qiu was not dead and the danger had been averted. Even though he was still unconscious, everyone felt like they had found their pillar of support. Their hearts were calm and the war was stable. The enemies who kept challenging and invading outside did not seem as scary as before. Shangguan Lingxiu carried Yunyang back to her tent, her face flushed and embarrassed. Once she entered, she realized that Ji Lingxi and Yu Rulan had followed her in as well. Both girls were looking at Yunyang with concern. What's wrong with him? It was Ji Lingxi who asked. Ji Lingxi's sallow complexion was still the same as before, as if she did not care much, but the flustered look in her eyes had already betrayed her. It was as if the pair of eyes had grown out of Yunyang's face, filled with anxiety and inquiry. Shangguan Lingxiu sighed inwardly and said, "He's all right. He's probably just lost too much blood and is a little exhausted. With Yunyang's cultivation base, he'll be fine after some quiet rest." While she said that, she thought to herself, what a sin. This girl who came out of nowhere is really Yunyang's fiancée? Otherwise, why would she be so concerned? It was just that she had never heard of this before. Marquis Yun, as a father, did not seem to know about it either. Yu Rulan said, "Lost too much blood? Younger sister, feed him some medicine quickly, especially those nourishing spiritual medicine. I think he must have lost quite a lot of blood. No matter how strong his cultivation base is, he won't be able to take it." She was, of course, talking to Ji Lingxi. Despite Yu Rulan's admiration for Shangguan Lingxiu and her closeness, Shangguan Lingxiu was still her sister-in-law's marriage. She could give in to anything, but she could never give in to her sweetheart. If she gave in just once, perhaps her lifetime of happiness would be ruined. She had to do it even if it was not the right time. Ji Lingxi understood her meaning and said, "All right, I'll take it now. I'll take care of Yunyang throughout the night today. He must recuperate in peace." Shangguan Lingxiu said, "Of course, the medicine for both younger sisters will be fine. Do it quickly." Having said that, she retreated quietly. How could she not know that these two girls must have come from noble families? She was destined to be no match for them in terms of heaven and earth treasures and resources. Since it was not as good as what they offered, she would use theirs. There was nothing more important than Yunyang's health now. Since they were repulsed by her, she would go out first. There was no need to stir up more trouble. Otherwise, it would only make things difficult for Yunyang. Standing at the top of the mountain, Shangguan Lingxiu's hair fluttered as her thoughts drifted. "I'm a daughter of a family of generals. My life has long been destined to be spent on the battlefield. Who knows when I'll die on the battlefield? Yunyang still has a bright future and a bright youth. Why should I be tied down by my love and hold him back? He's one of the 9 supremes, he has a myriad of tricks up his sleeves. He's a presence destined to soar through the 9 heavens. No one can kill him. I like him, but how can I keep up with his footsteps? Let it pass then. That's fine. Let it be. Despite her thoughts and her mood, Shangguan Lingxiu suddenly felt an inexplicable pain in her heart as she stood there. The sudden surge of sorrow was endless and difficult to suppress, as if her heart had been sliced into 7 or 8 pieces. This was the so-called heart-wrenching pain. She stood in the night breeze, tears rolling down her cheeks in a daze. Far away, the noise of battle could be heard from afar. The daughter of a family of generals laughed self-deprecatingly as she cried, "Shangguan Lingxiu, oh Shangguan Lingxiu, even your love, even your abandonment, even your sadness, they all move with the sounds of the battlefield. Your fate has long been decided, why drag others down with you? It's best for you to be alone for the rest of your life. Don't let those who have you in their hearts grieve the fated separation of life and death, never to be able to see each other again. Sister Lan, have we gone too far?" Ji Lingxi said to Yu Rulan with a blushing face as she fed Yun Yang medicine. "Sister Lingxiu has always been nice to us. I can see that she genuinely likes Yun Yang." Chapter 504. Yu Rulan sighed. "How could I not know that I've gone overboard? However, I'm the only one who's gone overboard, not you. Besides, I had no other choice. Shangguan Lingxiu is a good lady, of course. She's kind and good-looking, and her family background is extraordinary. She can be said to be a rare beauty in this world. But, girl, this man isn't anything else. You can't be silly on this point. It's because of her feelings for Yun Yang that I've prompted Sister Yu to do this." Ji Lingxi asked in bewilderment, "Isn't anything else? What is it?" Yu Rulan sighed again. "I know that you're a silly girl who doesn't understand the ways of the world. As your elder sister, of course I have to think for you. Even when I know that I shouldn't, I have to do it. It's because Shangguan Lingxiu is kind, good-tempered, and beautiful that she's willing to disregard a girl's modesty for Yun Yang that I've done this. If she wasn't so outstanding and had done so many things, why would I need to worry about you and be the bad guy?" Ji Lingxi was still confused. Huh? Yu Rulan felt helpless for her sister-in-law's ignorance of the world and explained weakly, "Let me ask you. You like Yun Yang, we both know this. However, have you ever thought of marrying him? To be together forever?" Ji Lingxi stomped her feet and covered her burning cheeks. "Sister Lan. How can you say such shameful things?" Yu Rulan said, "There's only the 2 of us now. What's there to hide? Let me ask you, Shangguan Lingxiu likes Yun Yang too. She's a girl, yet she's hugging Yun Yang without a care in the world. If she's not moved by him, how could she do so? She wouldn't do so even if it's in front of 2 armies. Therefore, deep down, she must be hoping that she and Yun Yang will be together. Here's the question, if the 2 of you were to compete, would you and Yun Yang be a pair? Or would she be with Yun Yang for a long time?" Ji Lingxi paled. It's an undeniable fact that she treats you so well and that she's a good person. But it's also an indisputable fact that she likes the same man as you. Will you give in just because she's a good person? Are you going to give your lifelong happiness to her?" Yu Rulan asked in a low voice. Ji Lingxi grew even more perplexed as she mumbled, I really didn't think that far ahead." Yu Rulan smiled bitterly. "So, how can I not be the villain? I'm already destined to suffer for the rest of my life. Don't tell me I have to watch you, his only sister, suffer for the rest of your life?" Ji Lingxi was at a loss. It was obvious that she had never thought that in such a short time, with just a few simple words, her sister Lan had already fought Shangguan Lingxiu on her behalf more than once. But, Is there no other way? Ji Lingxi murmured. Yu Rulan held her forehead with one hand, speechless. This silly girl, can you find another way to do this? Can you find another way? If he fought for it, he might regret it. But if he didn't, he would regret it for the rest of his life. Yun Yang had fallen into a coma due to excessive blood loss and mental and physical exhaustion. Qiu Jianhan, who had been nourished by Yun Yang's blood, was lucky enough to survive, but he was still unconscious. Yutong's two hidden and visible personages were both unconscious, but the war would not stop because of them. Perhaps, it should be said that the war of the century between the two empires would not stop because of anyone or anything. In fact, even from the moment Qiu Jianhan was rescued, the war between the two empires had not stopped for even a moment. Fu Baoguo had spent all his time arranging his troops to defend against Dongxian when he was not concerned about the old marshal. Fortunately, the old marshal had bought him a few days of time. Fu Baoguo had used the terrain he had built these days to almost engage Dongxian. What made Fu Baoguo feel the most fortunate was that Han Sanhe had not made a move ever since he had defeated Qiu Jianhan. All the battles now were being commanded by Zhang Gu. Although Zhang Gu could be ranked among the world's famous generals with his incisive tactics and strategic planning, he was not far from Han Sanhe. However, Fu Baoguo had always felt that he could cope and persevere with the limited military strength he currently had. If Fu Baoguo had to give a reason, it would probably be that as long as he was not facing Han Sanhe, the suffocating feeling of being in the middle of a raging storm did not exist. Yes, when he faced Han Sanhe, he felt like he was being suppressed and unusually passive. Now, however, even though his available military strength was still not much, almost twice of the other parties, he always felt more confident that he would not fall, that he would not lose. The truth was just like Fu Baoguo's judgment. Every mistake Zhang Gu made in the war, or rather, it should be called a mistake, it should be, the gap between commands, Fu Baoguo could always grasp it accurately. Then, he would counterattack or seize the opportunity to regroup and stabilize the perilous situation on his side. The situation was getting more and more disadvantageous for Yutong because Yutong's military strength was decreasing rapidly in the battle. How could they not pay a considerable price in order to fight an enemy that outnumbered them? However, Fu Baoguo could still maintain his composure. The time they had held out had far exceeded their expectations. Every day they could hold out was already a gain. Every day they could hold out, Yutong's chances of winning this war would increase. Fu Baoguo did not hold back anymore. He divided his steel cavalry into 3 squads and attacked in turns. The remnants of the Baoguo army formed 2 squads as well, supporting the attack with the steel cavalry. Other than that, Fu Baoguo had also formed a specialized vanguard team with the ace cultivators in the troop. This group of people was led by Bai Yixue, Fang Mafei, and Marquis Yun. Their role was to attack the enemy's formation in turns. In spite of this, they would only launch their attacks when the enemy's tactics were lacking. Only then could they ensure that each attack could cause massive damage to the enemy while minimizing the number of casualties on their side. Now, Fu Baoguo had gradually realized where his side's advantage lay. Perhaps, his military strength, combat power, and number of people were not as good, and his overall situation was far behind the enemy. Furthermore, his defense line was in danger and could be breached at any time. In spite of this, his biggest advantage now was the fact that he had 3 superb experts to watch over him. Bai Yixue, Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, Fang Mafei. The martial skills of these 3 people were unparalleled among the millions of soldiers of the 2 countries in this decisive battle. They were also his biggest trump card, his strongest asset. Fu Baoguo ran over with a drooling face. Brothers, help me charge a little more. Bai Yixue was the most unfortunate of them all. Whenever something like this happened, he was the one who led the team 7 out of 10 times. Who asked him to have the highest cultivation base? Besides, there were other reasons. Big brother, I've just charged once. Bai Xue was even less courteous to Fu Baogua now, not even addressing him as marshal but as big brother. To be called big brother by a heaven realm ace cultivator, Fu Baogua should feel honored. Cough, old marshal's situation isn't very stable. Marquis Yun said, I'm a little worried. What if, before Marquis of Heavenly Clouds could finish his words, Bai Xue had already charged out with a dark expression. The sentence that he did not finish was the magic weapon that rendered Bai Xue speechless. Qiu Jianhan had been shot by an arrow under his protection. It was a sure fire. Old Fang, it's your turn next, isn't it? Old Bai. Fang Mafei sighed. Young master is still unconscious. I'm worried. What if he's shot by an arrow? Thus, Bai Xue charged out again with a dark expression. He was cursing inwardly, oh man, can't you King catch me? Just because of such a trivial matter, you're treating me like a laborer and ordering me around. How dare you? To think that I, Bai Xue, was famous in the martial world back then, let alone the me now. Bai Xue grumbled bitterly. Sigh. Who was the person I was protecting back then? I'd been through hundreds of battles along the way. When I reached the destination, I was covered in wounds from head to toe and almost died. But guess what happened to the person I was protecting? Marquis Yun asked. I'm not guessing. I'll just lead the team and charge. Bai Xue charged out again, his face flushed. Oh man, you really can't make mistakes. This was Bai Xue's reflection on this incident. If his weakness was really caught, he would not be able to turn the tables for a very, very long time. Although the situation had taken a turn for the better, Fu Baogua, as Yutong's marshal, was still uneasy. He was even more confused. According to the current situation, as long as Han Sanhe pushed harder and broke through Tianxian Cliff, he would be able to sweep through the empire of Yutong. There would be no more obstacles. At the same time, it would also mean that the merit of the empire of Dongxuan's expansion would be in their hands. Furthermore, Dongxuan's position as the continent's hegemon would be established from then on, perhaps even stabilized once and for all. However, Han Sanhe had suddenly stopped caring at this critical juncture. He had handed everything over to Zhang Gu. He had gone to the side to drink tea. What did this mean? Fu Baogua thought that this was incomprehensible. If it had been him, why would he not follow up on his victory at this juncture? Even if Han Sanhe wanted to train his troops and groom his successor, there was no need to do so at this juncture, was there? It was important to teach a disciple and train a successor, but was there really a need to train him at this juncture? To put it nicely, it was losing the greater good because of a small gain, but to put it in a more serious manner, it was a hindrance to the military's plans. The crime was unpardonable. Furthermore, it was obvious that they wanted to hand over the great credit of expanding their territory to Zhang Gu. This made Fu Baogua even more confused. Was Han Sanhe an idiot? Chapter 505. Fu Baogua was at a loss. He thought about it again and again, but he could not figure out what Han Sanhe was thinking or what he was plotting. Now that the Fortress of Resilience had been breached, Yutong's natural barrier had been lost. Although the new defense line that they had built was known as another Fortress of Resilience, where the people lived, the fortress would cease to exist if the people died. Fu Baogua felt that the pressure he was currently under was not as strong as when he was at the Fortress of Resilience. It was undeniable that Zhang Gu was a top-notch marshal. Although he was still not as good as Fu Baogua, he had slowly pushed Dongxian to the edge of victory with the initiative that he had accumulated bit by bit. Up until now, both Zhang Gu and Fu Baogua knew very well that the final battle would probably happen within a day or two. The final outcome would definitely be Yutong's defeat. This point was already the general trend, and no one could change it. Fu Baogua had stood his ground until now. Watching his men die one by one, he was already well aware of the situation. Although he was better than Zhang Gu in terms of military strategy, and his thoughts were more experienced and meticulous, he could not make bricks without straw. Tianxian Cliff would be the last battle of his life. If he did not become a deserter, he would definitely fall here. There would be no chance of survival. However, whether it was as Yutong's Eastern Frontline Marshal, the person who had made a pact with Supreme Wind that day, or just a Yutong citizen, Fu Baogua would never allow a second stain to be tainted in his life. I, Fu Baogua, would rather die here than take another step back. This is the fortress of resilience as well. I couldn't fulfill my vow to fall with the fortress of resilience. Let me truly live and die with this fortress of resilience that I've built with my own hands. Teacher, why? Zhang Gu had the same doubt as Fu Baogua. Han Sanhe looked at the dark clouds in the sky with his arms behind his back and said faintly, I thought you would understand. In the end, you still managed to ask. Zhang Gu was taken aback. Teacher? Han Sanhe sighed dejectedly, you will understand, Zhang Gu. I only hope that when the time comes, you won't take the wrong path. Zhang Gu was shocked and blurted out, Teacher, could it be? Han Sanhe waved his hand, ending the topic. He turned to look at Zhang Gu and said, Do you know why I want you to defeat Fu Baogua personally? Zhang Gu said, Teacher, please dispel my doubts. This disciple will respectfully receive your teachings. Han Sanhe said slowly, There are many strange things in this world. There were also many strange things happening on the battlefield. But how did a famous general grow up? Based on this old man's lifetime of experience, there is only one path, and that is to step on the corpses of other famous generals to rise. This conclusion is also applicable to the commander-in-chief of an army. Only by defeating a commander-in-chief who is of the same level or higher than him can one rise to fame. If this was all, it would still be within the scope of an ordinary person's understanding. However, there's another strange thing about this duel. When you fight a famous marshal on the battlefield and finally defeat him, you'll unknowingly learn his commanding method. It's like you've suddenly learned a lesson, a feeling of enlightenment that grows inexplicably. You've learned it all at once, and you've improved. You've taken a huge step forward, to an extent that you can't even imagine. Han Sanhe said, This is something that outsiders can't understand. Only the person involved will know. From what I understand, it's probably because you fought him 8 to 10 times. It's the same battle before, but as long as there's no winner or loser, no life and death, you won't have this sudden epiphany. Once there's a life and death outcome, you'll definitely have this epiphany. Do you understand now? Defeating and killing Fu Baogua is your chance. Han Sanhe said softly but with a hint of melancholy, When you really defeat Fu Baogua, you'll be able to understand half of what I'm thinking now. Zhang Gu was shaken, but he said respectfully, Thank you for your guidance, teacher. Han Sanhe said slowly, It's too early to thank me. If you can defeat Taizheng then, you'll understand 70% of me. If you defeat Leng Daoyin, you'll understand 90% of me. Zhang Gu felt like a war drum was ringing in his heart, unable to speak for a moment. Han Sanhe said slowly, As for fully understanding me, you'll have to fight me head-on and defeat me. Only then can you understand me completely. What I can't figure out now. I'm afraid you'll be able to figure it out by then. Zhang Gu was sweating profusely. How dare this disciple have such extravagant hopes? Han Sanhe smiled faintly and said, Where there's a will, there's a way. How will you know if you don't work hard? Now, go and command the battle. If my calculations aren't wrong, the outcome will be decided before dawn the day after tomorrow, this war will end by the second half of tomorrow night at the latest. Fu Baoguo walked towards Qiu Jianhan's tent with a grim expression. Qiu Jianhan was still unconscious. However, there was an additional person in front of his bed. It was Yun Yang. Yun Yang was almost fully recovered by now. "How is it, Marshal Fu?" Yun Yang asked with a smile. This puzzled Fu Baoguo. He had never met this young Master Yun before, had he? Why did he feel like he was very familiar with him when he spoke to him now? Not good. Not good at all. Fu Baoguo sighed. The situation is really not good now. Fu Baoguo said with a grim expression, "Young Master Yun, I have a favor to ask of you. I hope young Master Yun won't reject it." Yun Yang said in a low voice, "Please speak, Marshal Fu. As long as it's within my capabilities, I won't hesitate. The defeat of this war is inevitable. Even if there are 1,000 clever plans, there's no turning back. This war can be lost, but Yutong can't be destroyed. The elites of our nation can't be wiped out here." Fu Baoguo said word by word, "So I'd like to ask young Master Yun to escort old Marshal away. Only with young Master Yun's personal escort can old Marshal return safely and I can be at ease." Yun Yang asked seriously, "What about you?" Fu Baoguo did not answer. After a pause, he said, "Shangguan family of generals young lady Lingxiu is the current benchmark of the family. She's significant and can't be allowed to perish here. Your father, Marquis Yun, Bai Yi, Fang Mafei, and the rest are all elites of the empire. It would be the empire's misfortune if they were sacrificed in vain here. Other than that, the Shangguan family of generals 8,000 family warriors have fought until now. There are still more than 2,700 people left. Young master, please don't feel burdened. The escort troop that I can give you this time won't be more than 5,000 people. Without these people, how can everything be done? I'd like to make it clear here that this mission is by no means easy. In fact, it's exceptionally arduous. Perhaps, it can be said that the empire's future, whether it can rise again and be reborn, all rests on your shoulders." Fu Baoguo's expression was cold, indescribably determined. Yun Yang asked again, "I understand what you've said, but I'd like to ask Marshal Fu to answer me. What about you, Marshal Fu? What about you?" Fu Baoguo smiled faintly. "I, Fu Baoguo, have promised Lord Supreme Cloud that I'll live and die with the Fortress of Resilience. It's a pity that I've gone back on my word under old Marshal's strict orders. Even if I say that I'll build another Fortress of Resilience, I've still gone back on my word. However, no matter how much I've gone back on my word, I can't run away in a fluster when I've arrived at Tianxian Cliff with the 9 Supreme's Lord Spirits watching from above. As a soldier of Yutong, a citizen of Yutong, dying on the battlefield before the country is destroyed is the greatest honor of a soldier." Fu Baoguo said softly, "As a soldier, if I'm still alive when the country is destroyed, it'll only be the greatest humiliation of my life. There's no way to wash it away." Yun Yang snorted and said, "What are you talking about? Even if the country is destroyed, what about the soldiers who are still fighting unyieldingly, who are still contributing to the recovery of the country? I say, they're all heroic men. How can they bear the humiliation that they can't wash away for the rest of their lives?" Fu Baoguo said faintly, "Of course they're heroes, they're deserving heroes. However, they've never been at the front line before. I, Fu Baoguo, am at the front line now. This is the difference. If I can't die here, it'll be a humiliation that can never be washed away in this world." Yun Yang was silent. He understood what Fu Baoguo meant. The frontline defense troops' duty was to protect the country. If it was breached by the enemy, it would be an unpardonable crime. No matter what reason there was, no irresistible factor, no matter what, this crime could not be erased. Even when the entire nation understood that it was a last resort and could be forgiven, they themselves would never forgive themselves. They would always be brooding over it, unable to let it go. Furthermore, how many people in this world were actually rational enough to put themselves in the shoes of these border warriors? When the situation really came to a head, how many people would dare say that they could forgive them? Regarding my own safety, there's no need for young master to worry about it. I only have this one request. I hope that young master Yun can help me, Fu Baogua said. Yun Yang asked curiously, there are so many people here and everyone seems to be more powerful than me, more suitable to deal with the current crisis than I am. Marshal Fu, why do you have to look for me? Aren't you thinking too highly of me? Fu Baogua smiled. Why does old Marshal think so highly of you? Why did old Marshal not look for anyone else but you at the very last moment? He doesn't even allow a third person to be present. These are my reasons. Chapter 506. The only regret of this battle is that I didn't get to see Lord Supreme Cloud and I don't know how he's doing now. Fu Baogua sighed deeply. I only hope that Lord Supreme Cloud is blessed by the heavens and that he's well. To me, no, to all of Yutong's subjects and people, as long as Lord Supreme Cloud is still here, Yutong still has hope. Fu Baogua's eyes were looking at the distant sky, his gaze filled with nostalgia and gratitude. Yun Yang said softly, I didn't expect Marshal Fu to trust Lord Supreme Cloud so much. Fu Baogua's head was still raised, his voice unusually indifferent. When Lord Supreme Cloud turned into Supreme Wind, he enlightened me and gave me a new life. If it weren't for Lord Supreme Cloud, would have lost my reputation and died without a complete corpse. Yun Yang was shocked. He did not expect Fu Baogua to expose himself in front of someone other than Supreme Cloud. Yun Yang was only Yun Yang, not Supreme Cloud. Naturally, that was how Fu Baogua felt. That day, it was Lord Supreme Cloud who pulled me out of the abyss. Fu Baogua said reverently, Lord Supreme Cloud is one of the two people I, Fu Baogua, respect the most in my life. The other one is my teacher, Fang Qing Tian. Yun Yang said, Old Grand Commandant Fang is of course highly respected, but Lord Supreme Cloud, he wanted to say that Lord Supreme Cloud did not expect to be repaid for his kindness and did not wish for Fu Baogua to die in the battlefield, but before he could finish his sentence, Fu Baogua turned to glare at him and said loudly, Ignorant child, although your surname is also Yun and you're also the son of Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, a descendant of the royal family, and you've made great contributions, there are some things that should be said and some things that shouldn't be said in this world. I've blurted out the past in a moment of life and death, but I've heard such rebellious words. It looks like Marquis Yun's upbringing needs to be strengthened. Yun Yang was stunned. Fu Baogua's anger had yet to dissipate. Young Marquis Yun, considering that we've been comrades, let me give you a piece of advice here. Thinking too highly of yourself isn't a big problem, but it's still a problem. Keep your mouth shut in the future, lest you bring death upon yourself. At least in front of me, don't make any presumptuous comments about Lord Supreme Cloud. You have no right to say anything good or bad about Lord Supreme Cloud. After saying that, he flicked his sleeves and left with a cold expression. He had left Yun Yang alone on the spot. Yun Yang was dumbfounded, speechless. What did I say? I'm just saying good things. I'm thinking about you. Why can't you tell the difference between good and bad? So what if I'm talking about Supreme Cloud? I'm talking about him. What can he do to me? Supreme Cloud hasn't even said anything, and you're the one who needs to stand up for him? And, what the hell was going on? I'm just speaking up for myself, and there are actually people who are defending me. It's so King awkward. This round of scolding was really a torrent of scolding. Night fell. This was actually the calmest night since the start of the war. Both sides knew that tomorrow would be the moment that would decide the outcome of the war. Yutong knew that tomorrow might be the day of their defeat, while Dongxian knew that they would charge past Tianxian Cliff in the battle tomorrow. From then on, the empire of Yutong and the fertile lands in the east would all belong to Dongxian, free to be ravaged. On this night, Dongxuan's troops were resting and building up their strength. Generals of all levels were lecturing and promising that as long as the battle was won tomorrow, how they would be promoted, how they would be crowned nobility for generations to come, how they would be rewarded, how they would. The eyes of the soldiers who listened were glowing with greed. Everyone was subconsciously imagining that after tomorrow's battle, they would be rewarded with unparalleled military merits and riches. If they could make more contributions, it might really be like what the officers had said, they would be crowned nobility for generations to come. Yutong's side, on the other hand, was silent. Everyone was trying their best to rest and adjust themselves so that they could have stronger stamina the next day. At the last moment, they had to kill as many invaders as possible. 1 or 2 would barely break even, 3 or 5 would be a profit, and if they could kill 8 or 10, that would be the final harvest that they would be able to die in peace. Countless people were silent, their heads lowered. However, the unprecedented aura of grief and indignation gradually spread throughout the entire army. They had fought until now, persevered until now, but were they still at the very last moment? Countless sacrifices, facing death countless times, but tomorrow was the end of the world. Was this the end of their lives? A veteran covered in wounds silently wiped the long saber he carried with him and sang in a low voice. Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield, fighting for the country all one's life, the ambition to fight on the battlefield, when the enemy comes, the bridge we pass, brother, you grab your saber, I raise my spear, charging and breaking through the enemy lines together, riding and wielding our sabers together, celebrating with wine, the long mountain road together, the long journey to the underworld together. Brothers are comrades in arms are comrades, you don't lower your head, I don't bend my back either, I face life and death, splendor in one hand, I come to my battlefield, you go to your trench, because we're the pride of our hometown elders. You have your old mother, I have my young family, you have your beauty, I have my daughter, when the saber and spear are in hand, when the enemy comes you, my chest, my blood is burning. When I turn into dust, it's also a soldier's glory, when you burn and turn into a rainbow bridge in the sky, brothers, we still smile proudly. Because we're Yutong's pride. You have the blood in your chest, I have the saber in my hand, you and I, side by side, fight today, if I die in battle, father and mother should smile. What's the point of a man's life if he doesn't defend his country? Father and mother miss me, look towards the east, look at the place where the flames of war are rising, I'm smiling proudly, smile proudly for the rest of my life. Smile proudly for life and death. The volume of the song was extremely low. This was a song called Smile Proudly, composed by a soldier after a battle. It had gradually become popular throughout Yutong's military, becoming a popular military song that almost everyone could sing. At this moment, the hoarse voice was singing softly, but it seemed to carry a strange rhythm as it floated slowly in the night breeze. All of the soldiers who heard the song began to sing along with it. Some of the soldiers sang as they took out their letters from home, reading the letters that they had read so many times that they would shatter with just a flip. Even when the letters were already stained with blood and had covered their original contents, the audience read them greedily, word by word, over and over again. When they were done, they kept them carefully and placed them in the most intimate spot. There were tears in their eyes, but there was a smile on the corners of their lips. Some of the soldiers rested their heads on their sabers, watching the twinkling stars in the sky without blinking. Their thoughts were unknown, but they could only sing along softly. Gradually, the singing spread throughout Yutong's military camp, reaching the mountain where the army was. It was like a gentle breeze, lingering to and fro, Fu Baoguo was also humming a song, inspecting his troops from tent to tent. Before the battle that was destined to come tomorrow, he wanted to look at each and every one of his brothers, at least once. He wanted to remember the image of each of his brothers in his heart forever. Even when his soul had departed to the netherworld, he dared not forget them, he could not forget them. Are you afraid of death? I was, but I'm not anymore. What do you mean? Why aren't you afraid now? Because I'm not afraid now. Fu Baoguo recalled the young soldier who was not even 20 years old when he had asked the question and the soldier's reply. He could not help chuckling, tears in his laughter. Although the soldier was only 20 years old, he was already a veteran who had gone through many battles. In the course of his young life, the battles he had gone through were numerous, if not uncountable. Tomorrow, we will die in battle. Fu Baoguo's voice echoed. Brothers, who has any unfulfilled wishes? Speak quickly. If it's possible, I'll do my best to help him complete it. This might be the last chance. If you don't speak now, there won't be another chance. The song was still melodious, but no one answered. Following me, Fu Baoguo, to die, does anyone regret it? There was still no reply. The song continued in a mellow tone. Then I'll nag one more time. If we die in battle tomorrow, our heroic souls will guard here and continue to fight against Dongxian. It will still be me, Fu Baoguo, who will lead all of you to the netherworld and gather our heroic souls to fight against the enemy. It was Fu Baoguo's voice. The military camp that had been silent all this while suddenly roared deafeningly. That's right. If we die in battle tomorrow, our heroic souls will still guard here and continue to fight against Dongxian. Going to the netherworld and gather our heroic souls to fight against the enemy. In the human realm, we won't rest until we die. In the netherworld, we won't rest until we die. No regrets. We don't regret it. The deafening roar was like the roar of a thunder god descending upon the world, ringing deafeningly through the entire mountain, shaking the 9 heavens. In the end, there were only 5 neat words: we don't regret it. We don't regret it. Shengguan Lingxiu, who was watching the scene from the top of the mountain, covered her mouth and choked with sobs. Big drops of tears rolled down her fair cheeks, she felt as if something was stuck in her throat. Fu Baoguo's Adam's apple bobbed up and down, unable to speak for a moment. His breathing was unusually heavy, like a broken bellow. Suddenly, he roared like a lion, "Fight to the end! Fight to the end!" Their ears were filled with the thunderous roar. Fu Baoguo suddenly guffawed. Brothers, all of us here, remember to leave together tomorrow. No one is to be left behind. Your father's military law allows for beheading whether it's the netherworld or the living world. This is military discipline. There was a burst of laughter as the soldiers chortled, "Your father won't be left behind. Not when we're alive, not when we're dead. What's there to be afraid of military discipline for? Let's sing. Continue singing." Fu Baoguo roared, "None of you have seen your father sing, have you? Your father will start today and let you know your father's songs." Then, Fu Baoguo was silent for a moment, as if he was brewing his emotions. All the soldiers stood up at that moment, puffing their chests as they waited quietly for the song that they had never heard before, the song that came from Marshal Fu. A moment later, Fu Baoguo's passionate voice rang out, "Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield, I wrote this song until 4 last night. It took me a long time to revise it." Chapter 507. The 100,000-strong army, whether they were injured, resting, or on duty, echoed almost at the same time. Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield, the song was led by Fu Baoguo, the chorus was loud and majestic. How could a chorus of more than 100,000 people not be loud and majestic? At this very moment, all of Yutong's soldiers could feel their blood boiling. The entire sky and earth were trembling, fighting because of the singing of Yutong's soldiers. The song spread far and wide, reaching the clouds. The vigor of facing death with equanimity, the determination to fight until the very last moment, was as solid as a rock, unshakable, indestructible, and indestructible. It was so loud that even Dongxuan's camp could hear it loud and clear. The fervent pre-battle mobilization also involuntarily came to a halt. Many of Dongxuan's generals walked up to the higher ground in silence, gazing at the pitch-black hill on the other side. The deafening song was coming from the other side of the hill, their gazes filled with uncontrollable respect. Zhang Gu also stared at the other side of the hill in silence, his gaze exceptionally complicated. Only Han Sanhe remained in his tent, not observing Yutong's movements. He stood with his arms behind his back, but the complicated expression on his lean face flickered back and forth. After some time, he finally walked out of the tent with his arms on his back and came to the top of the hill. Zhang Gu was already standing there, looking at Yutong's camp. Seeing Han Sanhe's arrival, he turned to greet him at once. "Teacher, you," there was hesitation and respect in his voice, but more than that, it was a contradiction that stemmed from his own self-doubt. "It looks like you've realized it as well," Han Sanhe said faintly. The song was still reverberating endlessly. Even the mountains and valleys around Dongxuan's camp were reverberating from the rumbling. Zhang Gu swallowed with difficulty and said, "Yes, I feel that tomorrow's battle will be the most tragic battle I've ever encountered in my life. I actually have doubts about this battle that I've already grasped victory in." A bitter smile hung on Han Sanhe's bony face as he said, "Your feeling is right. The battle tomorrow will be unexpectedly brutal, but the outcome is still predetermined. Dong Xian will win, but it will be a Pyrrhic victory. Perhaps, it will be a losing battle. I've only encountered such an army once in all the battles I've been through in my life." Han Sanhe uttered word by word, 100,000 troops, 100,000 men of sacrifice. "This is too scary," Zhang Gu said, once. "Back then, when we were fighting Shangguan Lingxiao, we had set up an ambush and bribed our spies. The encirclement was complete, trapping Shangguan Lingxiao in sobbing Ghost Valley, 700 miles away from the Fortress of Resilience. We deployed 150,000 men and surrounded Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men. That battle was just like that." Han Sanhe's tone was filled with nostalgia. "What was the result of that battle?" Zhang Gu asked respectfully. "I was personally in charge of commanding 150,000 men on our side. Against 20,000 men, we had set up an ambush in advance, our bows and arrows in place. It was a perfect time, place, and manpower. All three factors were in place, our odds of victory were set in stone. There was no way we would fail." Han Sanhe sighed. As for the result of that battle, none of Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men survived. All of them were annihilated. When the battlefield was cleaned up after the battle, less than 500 of Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men could be found with their corpses intact, Han Sanhe said seriously. Zhang Gu suddenly felt goosebumps all over his body, a chill running down his spine as he asked anxiously, "What about us?" He was very familiar with his teacher's habits. By saying things like this, he was laying out the foundation for his side's losses. His side's losses would be a number that would greatly exceed his own expectations. Han Sanhe said faintly, "Of the 150,000 men, only 76,300 came back alive." Zhang Gu felt his heart skip a beat, breathing labored for a moment, his eyes almost seeing stars. They had the advantage of a geographical ambush and an insider, but they had still suffered a 1-to-4 casualty ratio. How is this possible? How could we, who had the advantage of time, place, and manpower, have suffered such casualties? Preposterous. Preposterous. Zhang Gu, who thought he had mentally prepared himself, blurted out, disbelief written all over his face. Why is it impossible? I was there that day, I witnessed it with my own eyes. Thinking about it now, it's still vivid in my mind, engraved in my soul. Han Sanhe said, did you know that some of the enemy's soldiers were slashed dozens of times, lying on the ground motionless? They were actually waiting for Dongshuan's soldiers to pass by before they pounced on them, biting their targets' throats with the last bit of their strength. When the corpses were collected, more than 30 soldiers died in vain because of this. Do you know, after that battle, only about 200 of Dongshuan's 76,300 people were lightly injured? The rest of them were basically unscathed. No, I should say that among those who survived, there wasn't a single one who was heavily injured. Zhang Gu was a general who knew his soldiers well, understanding the deeper meaning of Han Sanhe's words at once. His face paled at once. What a cruel battle that had been.